Good morning. My name's Hannah Kinney. I'm the head of the education department here at the Yale Center for British Art, and I am so delighted to welcome you to this rich day of conversations, questions, and future building. And before we get into the meat of today's program, I just want to start with a few brief housekeeping notes. Recordings of yesterday's keynote conversation between Stuart Nielsen and Justin Barry, as well as today's symposium, will be available online in a few weeks' time. We really hope that this provides you a chance to revisit these panels and presentations, and also for you to share them with friends and colleagues who weren't able to join us today. So look for those on our website in a few weeks. This symposium is about learning across disciplinary boundaries and really meant to cultivate discussion. And so we have scheduled ample time at the end of each session for questions. For those of you that are joining us online, please do type your questions into the chat, which is being monitored, and we'll feed those into the room. For those of you that are in the room, we ask you to raise your hand if you have a question and wait for the microphone to come to you so that everyone in the room can hear your questions and also those people online can hear your questions as well. We have a full day of sessions ahead, but there will be breaks throughout the day, and everyone is welcome to step out and come back in at moments that you need. For those of you attending in person, our restrooms, including single stall restrooms, are downstairs on the first floor. You can use the elevators to the basement floor, go down to the basement. There's also water fountains there, and we have a little couch inside of the restroom if you need to just take a break. There will be a break for an hour and a half for lunch at 12 o'clock. Lunch is on your own, and then session 2 will begin promptly at 1:30. In the afternoon, we will have a short 15-minute break between 2:30 and 2:45. As the schedule that you've all seen for today's shows, Neurodivergence and Art Museums brings together voices from a variety of fields, from medicine, public health, architecture, engineering, design, and museum education to collaboratively imagine, or perhaps reimagine, art museums as public spaces that embrace and engage individuals with a diverse range of neuroabilities, and to create opportunities for dialogue, connection, and innovation. Today's symposium is composed in 3 sessions. We'll start this morning with session 1, What is Neurodivergent Museum Education? This conversation will explore how art museums can create inclusive, accessible, and engaging environments for neurodiverse and neurodivergent visitors. Educators will share programs that support sensory exploration, creative response, and personal connection. After lunch, we'll have session 2, Creative Confrontations with Space, which will show how museums and public spaces more broadly can be thoughtfully designed to meet the needs of neurodivergent individuals. Panelists will reflect on how architecture, urban planning, and inclusive design can better support diverse sensory experiences, agency, and engagement. And this discussion is grounded in cross-disciplinary insights from architecture, psychology, and lived experience. Our third session, Redefining the Art Museum's Interior Spaces, an Ethical Commitment to Justice, Design, and Access, will take the form of a cross-disciplinary discussion intended to advance understanding and generate actionable improvements to accessibility and design in art museums for neurodivergent individuals. The panel will consider how adaptations have been made in other fields, including environmental studies, bioethics, design, history, and the performing arts to address the needs of neurodivergent individuals. And finally, we'll close out the symposium with concluding remarks from Matthew Capizzuto, educator for K-8 family and access programs here at the YCBA. If that isn't enough for you, there are 2 further events after the symposium that you can take part in. Tonight, Tonight at the Chapel Haven Schleifer Center, there will be an event from 5 to 7 titled Inclusivity in Action, an evening of community, creativity, and connection. They are providing round-trip bus service from the YCBA and area hotels up to Chapel Haven. And the evening will include a New Haven-style pizza truck from the Big Green Truck, guided tours of Chapel Haven's vibrant campus, and a panel discussion on inclusivity in action. And finally, tomorrow, if you're not coming to Community Day here at the YCBA, there is going to be a performance at the Yale Repertory Theater, and they're inviting guests to attend its upcoming relaxed performance of Spunk by Zora Neale Hurston, specifically designed to offer a laid-back and inclusive atmosphere for those who may find traditional theatrical settings a bit overwhelming. Before turning the floor over to our first speaker and the conceptual organizer of this symposium, Linda Friedlander, our senior educator for engagement and outreach here at the YCBA, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge the program she has nurtured at the YCBA for neurodiverse audiences and how they have really brought this day to fruition. Over the past year, since I joined the YCBA, I've had a chance to learn more about these programs and how they've evolved and grown over time through partnership and iteration. Our longest running program, Out to Art, began nearly 15 years ago when Linda saw Tina Manchetti of Chapel Haven, who continues to be our strong partner today, bringing students to the museum. Together, they developed Out to Art to provide Chapel Haven residents the opportunity to make the museum their own space through repeated visits, as well as opportunities like curating displays of museum objects and presenting about them in our museum spaces. Linda worked really hard to foster this repeated welcome by staff members across the museum, including our security officers on the floor. And this gave and continues to give students confidence and comfort to navigate our galleries, even independently. A few years after launching Out to Art, Linda created Exploring Artism, an in-museum experience for children on the autism spectrum that also serves as a meeting place and a resource center for their families and caregivers. In the past 2 years, Matt Capizzuto has built on Linda's models through new work with the New Haven Public Schools off-campus classroom, an age-appropriate alternative high school education experience for students with intellectual disabilities that promotes independence and lifelong learning opportunities. Linda often speaks about repetition as a key element of success in these programs, and it's clear that repetition has also been important for us as educators and as space makers to continuously refine and iterate on our approaches, to expand our ideas through collaborative relationships, and to continuously open our doors wider and wider. Linda told me that when she began this work, there were only a handful of museums that she could look to as models. And now, years later, we see that many cultural spaces have embraced these practices, offering quiet spaces, sensory materials, focused programs, or special days. And while our institutions have been evolving, there is still work to be done. Stuart's comments last night reminded us that disability is not inherent to the individual, but often results from the environment not thinking about the needs of those who enter. And this gives us, as those who help to shape the experiences of visitors in museums and other cultural institutions, the impetus that they can be changed, transformed, and remade when we look at them with care and intention and, as we will see today, thinking across boundaries. With that, I will invite Linda to the podium.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you for being here. Thank you, Hannah. A very, very brief history of the Art Museum in the United States. The oldest continuous operating public art museum in the US is the Wadsworth Atheneum Museum of Art in Hartford, Connecticut. Okay. Which opened in 1844. Both the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City and the Boston Museum of Fine Arts were founded in 1870. Back then, the definition of an art museum was to be a source of education, social enrichment, and to help lift people from poverty, ignorance, and despair. The museum was to be based on wide public outreach and access, to be for everyone, and to provide for the well-being and growth for all. The message from the late 19th century was visiting a museum was supposed to make you a better person, and objects were organized to be educational and to better the audience. Museums were often considered the secular temple of the time, and the sanctity of the object was preeminent, even though they may have entered a collection as the spoils of war. Fast forward to 2025. ICOM, the International Council of Museums, is a non-governmental organization that serves as the global voice for museums and museum professionals. Its definition of a museum is, quote, a not-for-profit, permanent institution in the service of society that researches, collects, conserves, interprets, and exhibits, excuse me, tangible and intangible heritage. Open to the public, accessible, and inclusive, museums foster diversity and sustainability. They operate and communicate ethically, professionally, and with the participation of communities, offering varied experiences for education, enjoyment, reflection, and knowledge sharing. Until about 1970, museums and museum education, a new profession just coming into its own, were all about the object. Then there was a huge shift towards the visitor and various needs for engagement. Museums were interested in expanding audiences, both socially and culturally, by acknowledging the possibilities within which to learn and grow. They had an obligation to preserve their objects while making them more responsive to society's and individuals' needs. On the West Coast at this time, Ed Roberts and Judy Herman, both polio survivors in the mid-20th century, became activists who took up the cause that biology was not destiny. The independent living movement in the 1960s and 70s was a philosophy advocating for the rights and self-determination of people with disabilities. It was based on an idea of liberty that did not mean self-sufficiency, but rather self-determination, becoming the protagonist of one's own life, rather than the objects of others' decision-making. The reckoning. In the early 1990s, the Capitol building of the United States, also known as the House of the People, was the site of a protest demonstration. Excuse me, if you can walk up on your own the 365 steps it takes to reach the entrance. Hyman by now was a well-known lawyer, activist, and advocated for the American Disabilities Act of 1992. CRIP is short for cripple within the disability community. It was first used in the name of a summer camp, which was outside New York City and for crippled children in the late 1950s and early 60s. Human attended CRIP camp on a gurney-like contraption and lived her adult life in a wheelchair. Who says a picture isn't worth 1,000 words? It was a way of transforming the word cripple into a symbol of political awareness, identity, ownership, and pride. In the meantime, the world had established what is considered a range of normal functioning. That is, what most people need in order to thrive. If you fall outside this range, then help is needed. So who is the world designed for success? What are the traits, common behaviors that are normal and natural? And what is natural is, of course, considered normal. Sarah Hendren, an engineer, designer, author, and professor, describes disability as a misfit between a body and the world acute enough to be deemed a disability. Today, we will be trying to imagine a future that will better meet the extraordinary range of our collective needs and desires. Who decides what is a normal body? The idea of normalcy, a normal average body or mind, is ubiquitous. Its history as an idealized standard for human life in the early 19th century by social scientists grew from collecting and studying information about populations of people. These statistics could give doctors and others insight and understanding about people, especially mapped on something called a bell curve that helped researchers identify traits that were common and therefore not normal, and done by comparing and observing people relative to one another. Social scientists mistakenly assumed that what is characteristically true for a group should inevitably be true for any individual in that group. It took a century for normalcy to be considered desirable. What was common began to be seen as natural, and what was natural became to be seen as right. The introduction of the concept of normalcy created an imperative to be normal. That is, traits that were common are normal. Well, 1 billion people, that is 15% of the global population, live with a disability. In the last 10 years, there has been a surge of interest in the work of contemporary disabled and neurodiverse artists and curators by museums. This has led to an interest by some museums to be imbued across components into installation and exhibition content for the benefit of disabled and non-disabled visitors. These new points of connection for all visitors have been taken up as an issue of social justice. By making inequalities in the museum more transparent, artists are also engaging in institutional critique, agency, and empowerment. I am grateful that the Yale Center for British Art, Chapel Haven Schleifer Center, First Place Phoenix, Arizona, both residential schools for adults with social and cognitive disabilities, and Connecticut State Community College Gateway get it and have all played a role in the awareness and visibility of these ideas and actions. It is interesting that the confinement of responsibility by many museums for accessibility is to education departments and visitor services, which can sometimes insulate the rest of the institution from deeper changes that are needed. Words and their definitions: neurodivergence and disability. Neurodiversity and disability are terms used to describe differences in brain function and abilities with distinct meanings and implications. Neurodiversity refers to the natural variation in cognitive styles, learning abilities, and neurological differences. It emphasizes the uniqueness and value of these differences. Disability refers to a physical, mental, or sensory impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. It focuses on the functional limitations and challenges associated with impairment. It may be caused by a variety of factors, including genetic conditions, accidents, and illnesses. Some key differences may be that neurodiversity emphasizes acceptance and celebration of differences, while disability focuses on the challenges. Neurodiversity may have little impact on daily functioning, while disability typically results in functional difficulties. And finally, neurodiversity is often seen as a social construct, where societal expectations and norms contribute to the perception of differences. Disability, on the other hand, is more medically defined and recognized. Now, there are many variants on the definition of disability and neurodiversity. The aforementioned are but a small example, and I suspect you will be hearing more about these terms later from some of our panelists. A very large impetus for the creation of this symposium was to raise awareness of what museum education departments do for visitors with disabilities and neurodiversity. As educational engagement and outreach have increased tremendously, acceptance and support from museum leadership, and collaboration with many of the essential departments in curation and exhibition are all needed for success. There can be, however, exclusionary practices of curation, exhibition, and educational design. To conclude, I asked our keynote speaker from last night, Stuart Nielsen, what should the role of an art museum be in 2025? For many, Stuart's words, including late diagnosed autistic people and others with disabilities, traditional museum environments are often designed around neurotypical expectations, leading to discomfort, misunderstanding, and even exclusion of people who perceive and interact with the world differently. Many neurodivergent people describe a lifetime of mislabeling, being seen as lazy, disruptive, or unstable when their needs are simply misunderstood. A late autism diagnosis, which had happened to Stuart, he's very open about that as an adult. A late museum diagnosis can reveal a long history of unmet support needs. In art museums, this translates to challenges navigating physical spaces, interpreting social norms, and managing sensory input. For example, behaviors like zoning out, falling asleep, or fixating on a single work of art in a museum might be seen as rule-breaking, when in fact they are natural modes of interactions for some neurodivergent visitors. Spaces must also accommodate varied social behaviors. Designing for these helps museums support self-regulation and reduce anxiety. Inclusive design should balance different modes of engagement. Museums can honor diverse ways of interacting with art without one style of interaction dominating or marginalizing others. Neuro-inclusivity is not just about comfort. It is about equity, dignity, and access. By reimagining physical layouts, social cues, and cultural assumptions, museums can become inclusive spaces where neurodivergent individuals are not only welcomed, but empowered to engage fully. Thank you, Stuart. Thank you, Erin.
Good morning. Thank you, Linda. Thank you, Christina. Thank you, Hannah, for having us today and for inviting our group. We are a group of 4, though you only see 3 of us today. So I will be sharing Kamada, one of our team's slides and some of her words as she was unable to stay. She's unable to be with us this morning. So I am Jessica Sack. I'm the Curator of Public Education at the Yale University Art Gallery. And my job encompasses working with school, youth, family, teacher, access, and adult teaching initiatives. And I run a program that trains graduate students as museum educators. And I am joined by these colleagues who will introduce themselves as we go down the line here.
Thanks, Jess. I'm Jennifer Coet. I'm an associate professor of special education at the University of St. Joseph in West Hartford, Connecticut, where my teaching and scholarship focuses on the transition to adulthood for students receiving special education, and also the support of creating accessible spaces in the community with a focus on arts organizations. I'm also an art museum educator. I was hired by the Yale Center for British Art in 2004, right after I graduated from Yale with a degree in art history. Thank you, Linda, for hiring me. And over time, my work started to focus on creating accessible programming in museums.
Thanks. Good morning. I'm Rebecca McGinnis. I'm an accessibility consultant. Until a few months ago, I, for 25 years, oversaw accessibility at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, where my team and I worked on not only education programming that's accessible, but also kind of museum-wide accessibility, including things like exhibition design, working with architects on capital projects, training staff. you know, everything, and focusing on people across all ages, the range of disabilities, neurodiversity included. And I also identify as someone with a disability. I was born legally blind, and I was diagnosed in my 40s with ADHD. So I'm another of the late diagnosed neurodivergent people, I suppose.
And our colleague who is not here, Kamada, is the Chief Learning Officer and Director of the Children's Museum at the Queen's Museum, which I think is a brand new title for her. So when we get to her slides, I can share some exciting news about her museum. So maybe we could start by, for each of you, sharing a little bit about what this idea of neurodivergent museum education, what it means for you. And Jennifer, maybe you'd be willing to start by thinking about sort of special education and how this plays out in museum education.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm very interested in how best practices in museum education are really inherently aligned with best practices in special education and can really support some of the important work that teachers are doing. Just, as a quick note, I want to say I'll be talking about special education a lot because of the work I do, and many people who receive special education are neurodivergent, but not everybody who's neurodivergent receives special education or needs special education to benefit from being in school. Hannah, in her opening remarks, thank you, mentioned the collaboration that was started between the Yale Center for British Art and Chapel Haven Schleifer Center 15 years ago by Linda Tina Manchetti, Chapel Haven's art director, and I got pulled in as well, which was really a life-changing experience for me. Chapel Haven Schleifer Center is a residential transition program in New Haven that serves adults 18 and older with intellectual and developmental disabilities who are really learning the necessary skills to transition into an adulthood that meets their unique needs and what they think of as the life they want to live. And when we're talking about transition work through the lens of special education, what we're thinking about is the results-oriented, collaborative, student-centered planning that special educators do to help a child move from the life in school that they've always known and into the adult life that they'll live for the rest of their lives. And we think about that in three buckets. One is post-secondary education, the second is employment, and the third is independent living, which encompasses community participation, which is obviously really important to the work we're talking about today. And in the United States, we're mandated by federal education law to make sure that that transition work is driven by each student's unique set of interests, preferences, and strengths, taking into account the areas where they'll need support. And so that's exactly the work that's happening at Chapel Haven, but also in transition classrooms across the country. And so when Tina's class, Out to Art, started to come to the museum for 2-hour classes each week, we were really excited about kind of the work that we were doing. And as an example, I want to point out this image on the left, your left, which shows 4 students in one of the galleries at the Yale Center for British Art. The wall behind them is hung salon style, so there are many paintings in gilded frames that are very close together. You can see only little bits of the wall between them. And the students are taking on the posture of one of the paintings that you can see behind them, the one in, again, your upper left. Sorry, glasses on. And so we see 4 students who are sitting in front of the wall, or 2 are standing, 2 are sitting, and they're replicating the poses, and they're holding some of the some objects that are representative of the objects that the people in the painting are holding. And I really like this example to help us dive into what high quality museum education can look like, because you begin with a conversation about the work of art. What do you see? What do you see that makes you say that? But then when we ask students to take on the posture in a painting, it necessitates close looking and collaboration, because these students are the actors, but the other students are directing them. The other students can see both the students and the painting behind them, right? So they're working together to figure out, what is the turn of my hand? How do I position my body? Does this feel natural? Does it feel comfortable? Why did the artist do it this way? When we bring in touch objects like we see the students holding here, we can think about, well, how does an artist make us know that this is lace versus velvet with just paint and brush? Excuse me. So, obviously this is not just good work for our neurodivergent visitors. This is good work for everybody. And one of the things we've been talking about as a group is how these kinds of practices maybe started in our desire to serve neurodivergent visitors, but really became part of all of the good work that we can do. So I know we'll be talking about museum education a lot, but I'll just talk about why I think this is good special education. So I mentioned transition planning earlier. One problem is that we know the outcomes are not what we would desire. So many neurodivergent adults are underemployed. They don't have access to post-secondary education. And we know that there's a high correlation between adult neurodivergence and loneliness, depression, and isolation in our communities. Well, museums can be a big part of solving that problem. So when we think about, for example, how a museum could support positive outcomes in employment, we can think about, how do students decide what they want their career life to look like? You only know what jobs are available to you when you know a job exists. You only know if it is a good match for you if you have the chance to talk with people who do that work and try it yourself. And that's exactly what we're seeing with some of our Chapel Haven students in this image here. This is an image of the YCBA's installation team working with some of the Chapel Haven students to install a styrofoam bust that the installation crew carved out of styrofoam and then had delivered to the back entrance. And then the students practiced taking it out of the crate, moving it through the galleries, putting it in the vitrine. It's through that work that a student can say, I really liked working in a museum. I really liked the collaborative nature of this work. I didn't really like how much it required me to be on my feet. Can we explore other careers that would allow me to do the things I do like and avoid the things that I don't? But it's only through exposure. Similarly, if we're thinking about these concerns I have around isolation and loneliness, I love going to art museums. It fills me with joy. I only know that because I've gone to many art museums and I know how much I appreciate being there and I feel welcome. If we make sure that every student in our community feels like this could be a place for them and that this could be one of those healthy leisure time activities, I think that we could, as museums, be a big part of solving this problem. Perhaps I'll leave it there for now.
Yeah, this gives us a lot to come back to.
Oh, thank you.
And Rebecca, maybe you could talk a little bit about sort of lifelong relationships with and in museums. And I'm going to try to, there we go.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks both of you. Yes, I do want to pick up and kind of build on what you were saying, Jennifer, about the transition and also about this prevalence of loneliness and isolation. Museum education programs are a great way to develop to really start a lifelong relationship between visitors and museums, right? Any visitors. It's a starting point of a continued engagement across the life. And that, I think we also need to keep in mind that that's as visitors, but also as potentially museum staff, as museum volunteers, as donors, as board members, as any kind of museum user. So what do we need to create that foundation that's going to sustain and grow relationships that are fulfilling, that are, connected with museums. I think that sense of belonging is crucial, and that's something that neurodivergent audiences and audiences with other disabilities don't necessarily get. You might hear, everyone is welcome to come, but what does that really mean? I think Linda, you touched on that. It's not comfort and being welcome isn't enough, right? You need to feel safe. You need to feel truly included. And I would say that accessibility is a precursor to inclusion, right? You can, if a space is accessible, that means I can participate. But if it's inclusive, it means I want to participate, basically, right? A space can be accessible but not inclusive. It can't be inclusive and not accessible. So that's a real, kind of central to this idea of belonging. And the other characteristic that I want to echo that has been mentioned numerous times already is that the idea of self-determination and agency and offering choice. In the kind of history of museum education, the beginnings that Linda talked about, we started out with programs that were for a particular audience, right? So we're kind of, oh, we don't know how to do this for everybody. So just as kids with disabilities tended to be in segregated special ed classrooms, in museums, you might have programs that are for this particular audience. So I want to talk about a different way of thinking about inclusion and the role of a tailored education program there. I think that a tailored program can be a place where neurodivergence or any disability is centered rather than segregated. So if we're creating spaces around identity, around lived experience, spaces where, or places where, I should say, participants, you're not the only one. I experienced this a lot as a kid. I was the only one who couldn't see very well. I'd never met another blind kid until I went to summer camp, and I had no idea what to do. And just having that place that is designed both in terms of the architecture, but also in terms of the pedagogy, the social environment, as well as the physical environment. It is truly welcoming. It builds confidence and trust and community, I think, in a key way. You build relationships, community, you get it. I don't have to explain myself. I don't have to explain what neurodiversity is to the educators, to the other people who are participating with me. And that kind of centering environment creates agency and really fosters creativity. I can just relax. I can be creative. I can experiment. I don't have to worry about whether this is going to be accessible. Am I safe here, right? Be yourself. You can be yourself when your needs are met. Your needs are at the center and not at the periphery. So just, I wanted to mention as an example of that, the Met's Discoveries program, which was established in the mid-1980s. It started out with work being done in the early days, in the 70s, when disabled kids were first entitled to legally a free and public appropriate education with the IDEA Act. I think educators turned to museums as a place of informal learning to support classroom education in a way. And Discoveries came out of that. The Discoveries program, which is still going today, the audience is and we don't use the word, I'm not there anymore, they don't use the term neurodiversity yet, I hope, but people with developmental and learning disabilities and those on the autism spectrum. So it's a very broad range. And it is a program for families, friends. There are 3 groups, one for kids, one for teens and young adults, and one for adults, plus friends and family. So it's the idea is it's intergenerational, and it's always been that way. And the goals of the program were very much designed with those ideas of belonging and agency in mind. So it's to create a welcoming environment where people can connect with works of art, with each other through multisensory, multimodal engagement, active experiential learning, the things that Danny was talking about, and also a place to then build skills with art and skills with life, transition skills, self-determination, all of those things. And as a kind of example of that, something I would love to see more of, I think we need so much more of opportunities in museums, and Jenny, you alluded to this, is, for that continued growth, changing roles, being employed. We need role models among museum staff who are themselves neurodivergent and bring that experience to their work and kind of share with participants in programs that disability, neurodivergence can be not a deficit, but a generative force for creativity, right? For innovation. Here we have one of the Discoveries participants who's been participating for many years at different phases. This is Rintaro, who started participating in Discoveries when he was a child. I came with his mother before I even started maybe at the museum or in the early days when I was there. He grew up kind of with the program, had a tremendous interest in art, went to SVA, School of Visual Arts in New York, did a degree in graphic design, continued to participate as an adult in Discoveries. And then we, through kind of mentoring and talking with him about, what's next, Rintaro has now made a transition. He is now a studio assistant. So he's employed by the museum to assist with programs. He's also done some co-teaching. And I think that, that's just a tiny example, of following an individual through. There's so many opportunities in museums for internships, volunteer opportunities, as kind of partnering with places like Chapel Haven on vocational training. And yeah, I hope to see more of that and encourage you all to think about that if you're in positions to create those changes.
And so Kamada shared with us at the Queen's Museum a few examples, and I want to say that we also have tried very hard to describe the photographs we've used, the images, because we know not everybody, both in the room and online, is able to see these, and we think it's very important to be able to give a description of what's there. So Kamada wanted us to share that at the Queen's Museum, accessibility isn't just a program, it's part of the institution's DNA. The mission is to ensure that every person, regardless of ability, feels seen, welcomed, and supported in the creative places. And for nearly 2 decades, the Art Access program has served children and adults with developmental disabilities, autism, and other sensory or physical differences. And through hands-on art making, social connection, and joy, it has evolved into a model for inclusion engagement in the museum education. And so the photos that Kamada chose, this one shows one of the Art Access open studio sessions at the museum. And you see groups of participants of all ages and abilities gathered around large studio tables, surrounded by paint, collage materials, and clay. And then here, highlights an individual participant quietly working at their own table, and they're working with full concentration, supported by a teaching artist nearby, and the room around them is calm and designed to reduce sensory overload and allow for deep focus. And this moment captures what inclusive museum learning can look like. And then this final slide shows a rendering of the Suna Children's Museum as they are planning for it to look. It's going to be a 15,000 square foot expansion currently being developed with the Queen's Museum. The project represents the next step in the museum's evolution, bringing everything they've learned from art access into the physical design of a new museum for children and families. And you'll notice the wide open areas, natural light, and the modular design, which allow for sensory variation, meaning there's so many ways to engage with that environment. Now, something that the three of us have been thinking about a lot is the words space and place, and they're often used interchangeably. But we think deeply about the word place as being a built environment, and places have rules. You can be in place or out of place. Museums are places, cities are places, university campuses are places. They all are socially governed, culturally governed, and because of these rules, people can feel out of place if the rules of that environment have not been shared in some way. And so when we've been thinking about our work, we've been thinking about how can you make the most people feel in place or at home in the environment of a museum. And so in cultural geography or theoretical geography, the only areas in the world that are really space are outer space and perhaps, for now, sea. Everything else is controlled or delineated in some ways. Even our national parks have borders and therefore are designated, therefore, as places. So we think deeply about this as we think about how the environment of a museum can feel accessible and inclusive. So in hearing both what Kamada had shared and what you both have shared, I think we're coming to some kind of key elements of, I don't know if we would call it aspirational museum education or modern museum education. And this, Linda, I think goes back to what you were saying at the beginning of the unidirectional beginning, or sort of some of the ways it began, and what we're trying to aspire for now. And what I'm hearing from both of you is we're thinking about places that are interactive, that we're thinking about visitors bringing their own background and their own perspectives. We're thinking about multimodal engagement. So it's not just giving a lecture. It's not just talking. It's about how do you engage the senses of holding that bouquet of flowers, or in a studio, how do you think about the different textures or textual materials that can be in hand to understand something in a new way. We're thinking about object and place space, like why does it need to happen here in a museum, and how is that place of the museum so different from a classroom? What kind of learning can happen because we are in a museum and not within the confines of a classroom? It is not unidirectional. It is responsive. It includes some kind of guided engagement. And it relies deeply on collaboration, both the understanding of the participants' role in the experience, but also what the facilitator is bringing and their own biases and needs as the facilitator. And it's different from, but it complements classroom teaching, and it's inherently flexible. And from your descriptions, it seems like it is sometimes informal, but it's not passive, and it's definitely responsive. And I think it's so interesting in these examples that a lot of where this can happen most easily is in the studio setting, but it also can happen in the galleries themselves. And I'm wondering if we can open this up to a little bit more conversation among ourselves, thinking about a couple of things. One is, how do we seek out collaboration? How do we find partners for doing this work?
I'll just say, I think that that's absolutely a crucial question, because, one of my goals today is to emphasize how, all of these different kinds of educators, while maybe aspiring to the same goals, bring different perspectives and different understandings of the work, and different best practices that can really work hand in hand. And I think that sort of lack of hubris in some ways, the acknowledgement that, I, as one kind of educator, have so much to learn from another kind of educator. Tell me about how you teach. Tell me about, for example, an art museum educator going to a classroom teacher and saying, what are the routines of your classroom that I can bring into my teaching to make sure that your students feel as comfortable as possible? Right? There's no reason to reinvent the wheel. If you have very clearly stated expectations in your classroom, why not bring those into the museum setting? If the students are just coming once for an hour as a class visit, let's not spend that time having all brand new expectations. Students will feel more comfortable. So I do think that the dialogue is really crucial, and having time to do that.
Yeah, I would just add, in terms of collaboration, thinking of collaborating with participants and audiences, right? Nothing about us without us. Are we able to, and where are we able to kind of co-create and think together about what our audiences want to do in the museum throughout the different moments of their lives? You know, it changes. So what are the different things? How do we keep up with that? How do we co-create?
I think that that's actually a really wonderful contrast between what can happen in the classroom, or what often happens in the classroom, and what often happens in the museum. You were talking before about how, you know, learning in a museum is inherently co-constructed between the facilitator and the students as they dialogue together. That can feel very different from the kind of learning that that's taking place in the classroom, that's very standards based, and so on. So, you know, thinking about, well, then how do we bring the students' voices or the visitors' voices into the kind of their goals for learning?
Right, and enhancing and reinforcing self-determination and agency, self-efficacy there as well. So it kind of fits in with those goals.
It also makes me think about, how do we train people to do this work? And I'm thinking about this in the context of the range of ways in which people in museums become museum educators, whether it's by being a docent, by being a paid educator, being a gallery teacher. There's so many different ways that we think about engaging with the people who are going to do the work of teaching. And then, on the other hand, Rebecca, you were talking about this earlier, no one group coming in is going to have the same set of needs. And Jenny, in our other conversations, we've talked about how so much of classroom learning now is not having groups segregated by need. And so any group coming in could have 15, 20 different needs. And so how do we help the museum educator train to respond to what is needed by this group coming in?
Yeah, get the giant toolbox. Yes, I think that one of the strengths, I think, of museum education is the multitude of backgrounds that museum educators come from. You know, artists, art historians, you know, scientists, musicians. There are just so many classroom teachers. There are just so many different kinds of experiences and that people have that can inform their teaching. And I think that creates a diversity of, you know, this pool of people who are teaching, and hopefully that kind of can, I think, can make museum educators hopefully more open to this multitude of strategies, teaching strategies, and the flexibility that you need to try something, think it through, think about your audience's perspective. But then if it doesn't work, try something else. You know, that flexibility that's built in, because we're moving through spaces, right? So we could be in a classroom, in a studio, but we're also moving through gallery spaces, and there's so many variables there. We have to be responsive. We have to react and change up and be flexible. And so I think that's an essential characteristic of a museum educator, that flexibility and having lots of different things that they're ready to try. You know, got a plan, but it might shift.
Well, it also makes me think a little bit about how the desire to have the job of being the museum educator may be different now than it might have been historically.
Yeah.
Because if your job is going to be working with a diverse range of people and their needs, if you entered the field with one hope of
Right.
doing something, if you're entering the field now, I'm thinking, Jenny, about your question about like, what are these students learning when they're here? They may be learning, I want to do this work. And what does that look like? I'm also wondering for both of you, I've worked with both of you for more than 20 years in different kinds of capacities. What have you noticed in the field of museum education as it has become more responsive? Crickets.
The answer is such well, I think, we've been alluding to one of the things that excites me the most, which is access to the field of museum work as a whole and why that is so very, very important. And I think actually something I've been thinking about in response to all three of your last questions, so I'll say that here, is that, a major part of my work is I'm preparing future classroom teachers. I'm training teacher candidates. And one thing that matters tremendously to me is that they are prepared to use community places like museums in their work. I want to make sure that classroom teachers understand the benefits of coming here so that their students can develop holistically, and then also that they feel comfortable teaching outside of the classroom and in the community itself, because that's where students will spend most of their lives, right? They're going to spend most of their lives in the community, not in the classroom itself. So I do think that, maybe that's also an answer to this last question, is making sure that we're making sure the teachers feel comfortable integrating the work, the high quality museum education work into what happens in the day-to-day routines of the classroom. Now I'm curious what you're thinking.
Yeah, well, the first thing that comes to my mind is the change from a more kind of unidirectional lecture way of educating to an experiential way with multisensory, multimodal teaching strategies and co-creation and all of these strategies that really bring in the experience of the visitor as a shift. And the multisensory strategies, as one example, have come often. I think they've been developed in museum education, often in the context of access programs, programming for or designing any kind of programming, whether it's tailored or kind of general audience programming, but thinking of audiences with disabilities in mind. And that, those ideas have kind of been developed there and then have spread and are very much more, used for any audience, a general audience, than they used to be. And I think a lot of that work came from access, from thinking about accessibility and audiences with different needs.
It's almost like inclusive design as inclusive education, right? That if it works for one group, if it works for the group that's designed for in that way, it's going to enhance for everybody. I'm thinking about audio description or descriptive narrative descriptions of images, that a lot of people go to those kinds of audio guides because they are really interesting ways to look at someone else's perspective.
Right. Yeah, and there are all kinds of other examples of that in the world, right?
captions
on the TV, so you read the captions at the gym, right? Well, people who can read, I can't read them, but we use captions. A lot of people use captions, not just people who can't hear very well. Curb cuts, there's so many examples in the world of that happening.
You have me thinking a lot about how we, coming out of access work, we're really planning for ensuring multiple ways to respond, right? That not everybody is going to respond to the work of art verbally. And how do we make sure that there are multiple ways to express the connection that you're making to the work of art, to the people you're visiting with? Because, you know, often, not always, but often museum education is a collaborative experience, and you want to let the people you've traveled to the museum with know this sparks this memory for me, or this is why this work of art impacts me. We need to make sure that we're planning for multiple ways for people to express that connection. And I think that makes all museum education better.
Yeah, definitely. I agree. And that is validating to, you know, valuing those different ways, that different type of input and those different perspectives is, you know, validating those different experiences that maybe hadn't been valued in the past.
I mean, it also, you're making me think about two things. One is that it doesn't have to be a verbal response.
Yes, yes.
Right? And someone's like or dislike, the fact that you can, within the context of museum education learning, express dislike for something, and that is as important as the liking of something, that being given the opportunity to share your own perspective and be heard. I talk a lot with the groups I teach about teaching, that when we're asking people to do things or asking questions, we're doing it because we want to know what they're thinking, not because we want them to know what we are thinking.
And to build, for people to have the confidence to trust their own opinions, right?
Well, this is exactly self-determination, right? You know, so we've been talking a lot about self-determination, and I did want to make sure to mention at some point that, you know, part of the reason this concept of self-determination is so important is that decades of research in the special ed field shows us that students who have higher levels of self-determination, and there are wonderful assessments to measure this, have better quality adulthoods across the board. You know, these are students who have higher levels of self-determination are more likely to be employed. They're more likely to pursue and persist in post-secondary education. They're more likely to report liking their adult life and that they live a high quality, independent life. And when we're talking about self-determination in this way, you know, we're thinking about feeling like you have control over your own life. You don't necessarily always get what you want, but you feel like what you say and what you do is listened to and could affect the change that you would like to see. And all of these are different you know, everything we're talking about is really a different subcomponent of that, and an opportunity to develop the mindsets around self-determination and the skills around self-determination. So, you know, Rebecca, when you were just talking about how when a student expresses something in the museum and it changes the direction of the conversation, you know, one component of self-determination is an internal locus of control. Well, when you say something that shifts the direction of the conversation, that's a manifestation of your internal, you see, oh, wow, what I said mattered here. Jess, when you were just talking about the opportunity to say, I like this work of art and this is why, or I don't like it, it makes me feel terrible and this is why, that's connecting to the subcomponent of self-awareness and self-knowledge, which is, again, an essential component of self-determination. All of this works so beautifully together.
I would love, Rebecca, this is a slide that you gave us. And it shows, it's in the gallery, and there's a museum educator sitting on the floor with a green bag and a bunch of kids and a ton of supplies all over the floor. Can you tell us a little bit about what happened? What resulted in this?
What resulted in this?
No, I mean, what happened? How did this
happen
yeah.
here? This is from a Discoveries program. It's pretty old slide, but a part of, so the program begins in a classroom, same one every time. So there's that sense of familiarity. The theme is introduced, and then there's a gallery component, which includes a lot of things like sketching and other kinds of activities, whether it's kind of embodiment, movement, or touch, or music, sound, whatever it is. So here you have some sketching materials, gallery safe sketching materials, cardboard and paper, for sketching, colored pencils. So, you know, the sketching, I don't know exactly what the prompt was here, but the prompt would not be, you know, copy this, but really using sketching, using mark making as a way of investigating a work of art, as a way of experimenting, as a way of expressing. So the prompt could have been relating to texture or line or shape, something like that. You also have here that stack of colorful circles there are kind of inflatable like cushions, wobbly cushions. It's a type of, you know, fidget, really. For some participants, it's helpful to have that wobbly cushion as a way to, you know, be in connection with your body. You know, you have that movement, you can wobble, but it's actually can be a way of focusing. To provide, and I don't think there are any in this picture, but, you know, we have fidgets, you know, providing instructions in a visual way, breaking down tasks so that it's not too overwhelming. You know, don't give 5 instructions. This is what we're going to do, and then this, and then this, and then this, and, you know, nobody can follow that. Yeah, so that's kind of what's happening there. There's discussion about the work of art, opportunities to engage verbally, but also in other ways. And then they will go back to the studio and either they might use what they've started sketching or making in a studio activity that uses a broader range of materials, or something inspired by those conversations and the art that they looked at in the galleries. So that's what's happening there.
Thank you. I think this is a perfect time to open up opportunity for you in the audience and online to ask us questions. For those of you online, you're welcome to use this website, email address to send a question. And in the audience, we have delightful colleagues holding microphones. And if you have a question, you'll raise your hand, the microphone will be passed to you, and then anybody online can hear what you're asking, and then we will attempt to answer your question. So we turn it to you. There's a question in the front here. Oh, and there's a race to you. Careful.
Thank you so much. Thank you, all of you. That was so wonderful. Opening up that point about the agency to dislike as part of engagement, what are some of the questions that you ask specifically, and how do you ask them differently, especially for some of the neurodiverse participants who often are very impacted by the feeling of a paternalistic art museum? Yeah, I'm just curious.
I'm happy to start this. I will, when I'm offering a group an opportunity to do an activity, I'll say, find an object that you like or dislike, that you want to take a couple of moments to kind of respond to. So then they're given the choice of finding the thing that they are drawn to or the thing that they are not drawn to. And I think a lot about aesthetic and anesthetic, like the thing that puts you to sleep and the thing that keeps you awake, right? But it's also how I think about like the disliking. There's the disliking and feeling repulsed and like needing to recover. But there's also if it's doing something to you, maybe the art is working in a certain way.
Mm-hmm.
And so I like to have my activities or the questions I'm opening with be a chance for people to be aware of themselves in this place, in this environment, in response to that thing that someone has decided you should look at for a while.
Right. You sort of explore that emotional response. That is a response, right? Whether it's positive or negative, how does this make you feel? And kind of why? Yeah. So it's emotional, which has power, whether it's negative or positive.
But I think you make a great point about how if somebody's feeling really uncomfortable, we need to be prepared for that.
Mm-hmm.
So not mandating that our whole class is going to sit down right here and you have to stay seated the whole time, right? Making it really clear from the beginning that you're allowed to get up and
Move
move.
it.
You can move
If you
away
want.
from the object if you want to. You're welcome to move your body in response to your reaction to the work.
Yeah, you have a choice. You can, yeah.
You know, what position is your body most comfortable in to be here with us? We usually check with security, not usually, we check with security ahead of time to make sure that it's safe, that you won't get splinters from the material we're on, but like learning doesn't happen like this. It's not comfortable for everybody to sit like this. So what do we do to modify our environments to make it possible for people to feel in place at home? Oh, I see lots of hands on this side. Maybe start down here.
Can I ask a question?
Of course.
Definitely.
So an observation, this conversation wouldn't be taking place X number of years ago because museums weren't prepared to handle individuals who the school deemed as museums were inappropriate for certain children to go to because they couldn't handle it. They either lacked the diagnosis at that time, they never considered the behavior could be the result of a specific diagnosis, and museums were not prepared for this. So teachers kept kids back at school when they would make field trips, and they would actually report to the museum and say, we brought fewer kids because some we just couldn't bring with us. And then enter museum education and sensitivity and all the things that you were talking about.
We so often tell teachers it's okay. Like we are prepared for your group. And what we also find is that because the museum is such a different environment from the classroom, the kid who behaves a certain way in the classroom is going to behave a different way in the museum. And the kid who might not engage with a teacher often in the museum because it's a different kind of learning engages in a completely different way. And so the teacher sees their students in new ways. So we spend a lot of time saying, don't worry.
Exactly. So in my experience, that's my experience too. It's often the teacher who is afraid to bring their students, right? They're not sure that the museum will be able to cope, even if the museum is. And I know that's something over the years I've spent a lot of time working with, the groups and school programs people, colleagues at the Met, tweaking the form that teachers fill out or any group fills out, asking about the group's needs in a way that doesn't sound like, make them fearful that there are going to be barriers. We're going to say, oh, well, if you have those kinds of people, you can't come, but rather this is helping us to prepare for a visit. And sometimes that's hard in an online form, but yeah.
I'm thinking about your question before about is it still on?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Collaboration. This is, I think, a wonderful place where museums can be reaching out to teacher preparation programs intentionally, and especially special education preparation programs to say, let us show you what we can do here so that you feel more comfortable bringing all of the students in your school into what we have to offer.
Yeah.
And also parents, right?
Yeah.
That for a parent to know, please come, we're ready.
Yeah. But the other side of that is museum educators learning from classroom teachers as the landscape of classroom education has changed for students with disabilities and neurodivergence. Far fewer students are in self-contained special ed classes. There are many more examples of, inclusion classes, ICT, is that what it is? And, the different, or just general ed class that includes students with various disabilities. And for museum educators, then you have that, that range of needs that can be confounding sometimes if the toolkit isn't big enough.
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot to learn, from the classroom educators too, about how that can work all together as a group.
I agree.
We have a hand at the top on that side.
Hi, building off the previous question, I feel that I've seen the most change in educational public outreach programming. And also after the keynote as well, I have this for you. The rest of the museum has its rules. And sometimes what the educational programming is permissible of is not cohesive with the rules or the way the rest of the museum functions. And I've seen the disconnect there. So I'll give one real life example, and then maybe you guys have comment on this. My son who has autism, we were going to go to a program. The director of programs is amazing, love her. She wanted him to come. So I have a small book bag that has his headphones, his token system, these kinds of things. And she's like, yes, bring it. We get there, there's ticketing, there's docents. You're not allowed to have a backpack. So you're then under the scrutiny. With the keynote speaking, I was feeling this. You're under the scrutiny. You feel like you're doing something wrong. They're explaining it's something wrong. And you're trying to problem solve. I'll hold it down here. I'll hold it in front of me, whatever. I have permission. And now it's a thing and people are backing up behind you. So you're left with these choices on the spot. So that's just one example, maybe. Do you all have thoughts on that?
I'll just say that's a common example, that what's allowed to happen in a group may not be allowed to happen as an individual. And that inconsistency is problematic. So ideally, there's conversations within institutions where the resources that are developed or the things that are allowed to happen take into consideration the needs of visitors. That you don't have to self-identify saying, I need this, please, like this is medically necessary, or this is in whatever other capacity necessary. But also what needs to be in place in the museum for things not to seem scary to the people who are worried about those rules, right? Why can't a child carry their stuffed animal? They're not going to throw it. It is precious to them. There are so many examples, and these are things that in museum we are constantly in dialogue with colleagues about, because we understand the need to protect the art. We also understand the need for the visitor to feel comfortable and welcomed and understood.
I think another thing that can help there is that having tools to help prepare for a visit. So something like a social narrative, a social story where you can learn about visually what the experience of the museum is going to be like. And part of that can be, I can have a bag as long as it's not a backpack that I'm wearing on my back. Or, I mean, it varies in each museum, right? But what can I do? So you can, and you can kind of see what those interactions with the people who are going to be looking at that bag and be prepared for them. So I think that's another way of mitigating some of those kind of disconnects. Is there information on the website that's very clear about what I can and can't have? Or is there someone I can contact if there's this question about, here's something that I'm not sure if I'll be allowed, but I need this for, to feel safe or to be accessible and to visit the museum, there should be someone, it's easy to contact to ask about that.
I think this is a place where I'd like to see evidence-based classroom practices brought into museum education. And I haven't really worked out how to do this yet. But one thing I'm kind of exploring is, in a classroom, we want our teachers to be using positively stated expectations for all their students. And that these are explicitly laid out at the beginning of the year. They're returned to over and over again, so that no one feels like, I don't know what I'm supposed to do here, right? Because that's uncomfortable for all of us when we walk into a space, a new classroom, a new museum, and we feel like, I don't know what the expectations are. We want to be really transparent about what those expectations are, and then explicitly teach those expectations to the people around us. And I think your point, though, is so wonderful, because also what sort of we know through research into behavior and classroom management is that we also need to acknowledge that those expectations are different in different parts of the school, right? So our expectations for your behavior are different in the cafeteria, are different in the hallway, are different in the classroom. You just made the great point that that's the same in the museum. We are asking different things of you when you come for a group activity than when you're exploring on your own. I think transparency is key to making people feel comfortable. I'd love to talk with everyone at some point who wants to talk about this. Come find me.
A hand was up right down here. Oh, there's a whole bunch in the middle. So let's start at the bottom and maybe work our way up.
So my question kind of comes from a different perspective based on a few experiences. So I taught at a school for students with different disabilities, emotional disabilities, autism, dyslexia, dyscalculia, you name it. It was all. And I often wanted to get them out of the classroom and into museums. And sometimes I would call some museums and they're like, we can't wait to see you. And other museums were like, no, that won't work. No. So like, for example, one of the things was I had a student who took to the Wadsworth and we were looking at right? And then all of a sudden, a 30 student group of third graders came into that space. And some of my students were like, can I get out of here? And the other kids were like, I would have wanted the museum to basically off that space from other groups. So the nugget of my question is, how do you convince museums that are not as friendly and help them kind of bridge from what they're thinking, oh, can't do that, that breaks the rules, that breaks the norm. How do you do that?
It's such a brilliant question. And I think a lot about sonic environments. My team has divided our museum into, I think it's 21 different sonic environments. And we try not to schedule more than one group in any one sonic environment. There may be individual visitors coming through, but I was prior at the Brooklyn Museum. We thought about that a lot. Some people, not in museum education, find that the cacophony in a gallery is exciting and it shows that it's a popular place. That's great, but it may not be conducive to learning. And so I think in our field, we are advocating for thinking about how do you choreograph visits in the same way air traffic control choreographs landings. How do you choreograph visits so that everybody can be where they want to be, but intentionally and carefully, so that your students don't have that visceral reaction to being overwhelmed by the other group coming in. And the other group coming in doesn't have to share the, I mean, you don't have to share, you get your own turn in time.
Yeah. How does that work at the Met? I'm just thinking about the crowds.
You may be the cacophony, I don't know.
Yeah, it's always like you say, air traffic control. There are clashes, but there is a system of, booking particular galleries. And then also on the other side, in training, being sure that the guides, the educators who are taking groups through, follow some etiquette, of, not stopping too near, also having that flexibility to, I was going to stop here, but there's somebody else in the gallery, so I'm going to move, just having that kind of flexibility. So those are some things, from the booking side and also from the kind of training side, to help mitigate those clashes. But there are traffic jams for sure. Just also thinking about things like, is this object near a doorway? And if we're all crowded around it, is that going to block a path? There are a lot of logistical things. So that can help or hinder.
For those of you online, there's gymnastics happening.
Well, I want to raise another perspective. We've heard from parents with a child neurodiversity. We've heard from educators not in the museum. As a pediatrician, I've been doing this for a long time. And I have to say, Linda, I don't know when you first came here, but this museum opened in 1997. My kids came here by chance. There was an advertisement. They're now both right around 50. And there was an advertisement, something, whether it was in Yale or just a general paper, that there was some sort of an art opportunity for education for young children, like elementary school, I think, because that's what my kids were at the time, here on a Saturday morning. And my wife and I came in here, and it was incredible. It was amazing. Were you here there, Linda, by 77? Well, so 77 is when this opened. And so it was probably early 80s, I would think. And it was amazing. I used to tell my patients about it. I said, take a look, find out if it's available, because it's a fabulous thing. And I mean, here in New Haven, we're spoiled. I mean, we had the Peabody, you know, for years and years and years, which was always an attraction for kids. And this museum, interestingly enough, before the major renovation, there was like a sort of not a balcony, but when you would enter, there was like a mezzanine that went around, and there were amazing exhibits there sometimes. And nobody ever questioned you when kids were bringing things, and there were great exhibits. I remember one on nappies, collages from nappies and what different poops look like, and breastfeeding and things like that. And my kids were enthralled with it. So as a parent of a child with neurodiversity, first of all, most parents don't know anything about what neurodiversity is. It's one of the things I'm working on now that I'm not seeing patients anymore. You've got to do your homework. And I certainly was often asked about that from parents, but I think there are all these different perspectives. As an adult diagnosed with neurodiversity, it's a whole different ballgame, as we heard from Stuart last night. So I just want to raise that as part of what comes in to impact what you do in the museums. And you've got kids coming from all over the place. And even here in Greater New Haven, the spectrum is incredible in terms of what schools do and don't do. It doesn't mean that they actually do follow IDEA or 1973 federal law about kids with special needs. So I just want to add that perspective.
Thank you. There was another middle of the climbing.
I actually want to piggyback a little bit on the question you were asking earlier, and to ask the panel, do any of you have experience collaborating with, preparing, or training other departments in your institution to work with neurodivergent audiences? Because like she said, there are different rules in different departments, and the different rules might clash with the goals the education department has set up for working with these audiences.
That's a great question. Do you want to? I was going to say, do you want to ask?
Well, let's see. I do have experience working with other departments through those sort of, you know, logistical conversations, as well as staff training.
Yes.
Not enough. There's never enough. There's never time for enough. But I think, you know, staff training is super important there, beyond museum education, right? For people, staff, especially, really everybody. Because if you're behind the scenes, you can still, you know, your work is still going to have an impact on what happens in the galleries. But you know, especially for those kind of frontline staff, security and visitor experience, and anyone who's, you know, guiding people around the galleries, to have that awareness of different needs, and, you know, not to react and just, you know, say you can't do that, but to think about what really, you know, what is happening here, and is everyone safe? Is the art safe? Are the people safe? and, maybe ask a question, don't yell across a gallery. This happened, it continues to happen, I'm sure, with, say, touch tours, where there's certain objects that a blind or partially sighted person, individual or group, can touch with a guide now. But sometimes if a guard doesn't kind of assess the situation, they're so used to saying, don't touch, don't touch, don't touch, because everyone touches. It's one of the main things, where's the bathroom, and don't touch, right? The most common things to say. And so, a lot of work, kind of, these are the objects, learn them. If you're in that space, just go up and ask before you yell across a gallery. But also for the educator, to go to the security person when they get to the gallery and say, look, this is what we're doing, So there's also that two-way communication. So that I think that work continues, it's just constant to try and raise that awareness from everyone who's making the decisions about the rules to, just people who are monitoring what's happening in the galleries.
My museum, so I work at the Yale University Art Gallery. We are the sister institution across the street. And I'm on an accessibility committee where I am part of a team of people representatives from many departments, including exhibitions, curatorial, visitor services, security, facilities, and the director. And it really helps when the director has support of a project. And we had an exhibition training with a consulting firm that taught us as a team how our work is interdependent. How does graphic designs, how does editorial, how does the design of the physical environment affect visitors? And because not everybody with the same need comes on the same day, it's not like it's a group, it's individuals coming through. How do we make our exhibitions, our buildings, all these things that you're going to hear about later today, how do we do it collaboratively? And it's not any one person in the museum's job. It's work that we all need to be involved in, because this affects everybody. Huge percentages of our population are affected, and it's not about age, it's not about gender, it's not about race, it's about everybody. So as people who work in museums, we care about everybody coming to see these collections. What do we do? Yeah. One last, or was that it?
That was an amazing.
Yes, kind of. That's the conclusion, Jess. Thank you so much. And for the microphone holders, great gymnastics. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much to our speakers. We are going to take a break now. And I look forward to seeing all of you come back at 1:30, but can we have another round of applause for them, please? Welcome, everyone. It's so good to have you back. I hope your lunches were restorative. Thank you for returning to the Yale Center for British Arts Symposium on Neurodivergence and Art Museums. We are going to keep ourselves to a tight schedule, and so it is my pleasure to introduce our second panel, and Dr. Jamie McPartland will moderate and take it away.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jamie McPartland. I am a professor in the Child Study Center in the School of Medicine. I am a child psychologist, and my focus is autism. I run a diagnostic and evaluative clinic in the medical school. I'm also a neuroscientist, and I run a lab that studies the brain in autism and other conditions, really to try to understand whether we can learn things from the brain that might change the way we care for and support autistic people.
I'm Valerie Fletcher. I run the Institute for Human-Centered Design. We are an international design and education nonprofit. We've been around since, God help us, 1978. Originally founded as Adaptive Environments. Our work is centered on being deep experts in accessibility and inclusive design. We're pioneers in the universal design movement, but we have converted to the language of inclusive design quite a few years ago now. Our work is bent on really looking at the reality of disability in the world, in America, and designing solutions that are reflective of that reality. I'm thrilled to be here today with folks that I am meeting for the first time and appear to be kindred souls that I'm hoping to learn from too. So thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Elihu Rubin. I'm an associate professor of architecture and urban studies at the Yale School of Architecture. I'm an architectural historian and urban planner. I direct the urban studies major in Yale College. And I'm a faculty director of advocacy and planning for the Yale Urban Design Workshop. That's a community design group associated with the School of Architecture. We're doing neighborhood planning in Dwight right now. We're about to work on a project actually about inclusivity and accessibility at Lighthouse Point right here in New Haven for the Parks Department. And just one more thing, I've been very committed to doing public scholarship with my students and community-based work, and that research initiative is called the Yale Urban Media Project, or YUMP. And we do films and websites and publications and events working between students, faculty, staff, and the community. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Sean Alquist. I'm a professor of architecture at the University of Michigan. I don't know if my list is quite as long as my colleagues here in terms of what I do, but I also I'm a parent to a 16-year-old with autism. She's nonverbal, and her experience with environment has very much kind of charged the research that I do at the university, which might be better described with a few slides that I'll share in a minute. So the work is, at this point is very multidisciplinary, working with people in kinesiology and psychology, in computer science, material science, statistics. So all to try and get an understanding of how environment can have positive impact on engagement and behavior for individuals with autism and kind of across the realm, social interaction, for learning, for communication, for being able to be a better parent to my child. So yeah, leave it there.
Wonderful. So the way we're going to structure things, we're going to start with our panelists presenting a few slides about their work as context, and then we'll talk a little bit. We've prepared some questions, and then we're going to open it up for discussion with you all. So Valerie, do you want to start?
Sure, thank you. So I'm going to start with the data. One of the things that can seem elusive is, what do we know about disability? We know more than we think we know. And I'm sad to say that though we have been the very best country in the world, we work globally, I can say this without reservation, we've been the best in the world on counting disability until now. We can say goodbye to that now. This data slide that I've got in front of you now, which is 13.9%, the leading cause of disability in America, is a spectrum of brain-based issues. This is absolutely true, and we will never see another chart like this again because they stopped counting. So this is a heartbreak to me to tell this, but I've been using this data from the CDC. We work very closely with the CDC. Most of my colleagues at the CDC are gone. So this is kind of a mixed bag of sharing this with you, but it's terribly important you understand this. And I think the second most common reason for disability in America is mobility. You probably know that the standards and codes for accessibility focus almost exclusively on this population, but really only on wheelchair users. Wheelchair users are only 10% of this number. 10 times that number have difficulty walking or climbing stairs. Bad backs, bad hips, bad knees, bad feet are far more common than wheelchair use, and we don't pay very good attention. Just the state of Connecticut, where we are, is pretty typical of the nation. We have the highest rates of cognitive differences as the leading cause of disability, and I have to say, we in the New England states, the 6 New England states have all had this pattern for years. We have been way ahead of the country. Now the country is caught up. And it's terribly important to me because this is an issue that we feel very, very strongly about, is that we need to recognize that this is not a white phenomenon. We have had very limited research looking at cultural diversity in relation to neurodiversity and certainly autism. And it was really in 2020 that we had the first really solid peer-reviewed analysis that says, hey, whites about 2.1%, blacks 2.2, Asian 2.2, Latino 2.3. And that's the United States. We've got at least decent numbers here. I promise you, working across the world, There are a whole lot of people that think if it's brain-based, it's probably the result of bad karma. Got a lot of work to do in that world. We give credence here in the United States that's a little more substantive than much of the world. And I want to share with you something that I think is an enormous invitation to designers, which is one of the reasons why, I think I'm thrilled to be on a panel about the built environment, about design. And this goes back quite a ways. They actually introduced this in 2001. And it's the contextual definition of disability. They worked on this for 10 years. And there have been multiple speakers who've made reference, including Stewart, to it doesn't reside in the individual. It's about the intersection of the person and the environment. Who the heck makes the environment? Who makes the human context? That's what designers do, right?
Right.
And they were smart enough in 2001 to say, functional limitation is a universal human experience. Unless you're unlucky enough to die young, it's coming for you. You're going to live with it. You don't need to go simulate it. Go meet your neighbors, talk to your family, meet people who have real experience, lived experience with disability. The pervasiveness of it, the ordinary enough of it is so available. And it's so available that people want to teach students, this is the way to go. Equity between mental and physical reasons for functional limitations. My friends at WHO said it took 8 years out of the 10 years to get this one approved by the member states. No surprise there. Focus on the potent role of context, on the person interacting with the environment, physical information. Remember, it's 2001. We didn't live in a digitally immersed universe yet. And yet they knew it was physical information, communication, service, and attitude. And of course, attitude, and I think Stewart heartbreakingly made that clear last night, that sometimes it's attitude that is the biggest barrier of all. But it's that idea that we have the opportunity to choose, are we facilitating experience or are we disabling people? Functional limitation is a fact. In this construct, disability is a byproduct. So it was a negative idea that disability could be prevented or largely reduced to be inconsequential. And it's really a goal of independence, experience, equity, and participation. And they called for inclusive design. In truth, in 2001, when I was still very much in the pioneer crowd pitching universal design, the term they used was universal design, but it was the most promising framework. And we are still running with that, even though today I prefer inclusive design as a more meaningful term that people understand and that doesn't seem to include an expectation that there's a holy grail at the end of universal design. It is continuous. And I will leave you with one quote from one of the world's most accomplished and high-profile architects who has been a converted devotee of this for a long time, converted by the phenomenon of the extraordinary growth of neuroscience and what it has told us about how our brains work. When designing physical spaces, we are also designing or implicitly specifying distinct experiences, emotions, and mental states. And in fact, as architects, we are operating both in the human brain and nervous system as much as we are in the world of matter and physical construction. Amen. I'm done.
Thank you. Actually, this last slide is a good transition to what I wanted to share. I sort of wanted to provide a little bit of a studies perspective on this issue because the questions around stimulation or overstimulation have sort of fascinated observers of the urban experience from the very beginning in terms of experiences, emotions, mental states, and the nervous system and how it acclimates or the degree to which it does acclimate to the often overwhelming experience of the city itself. I mean, this goes as far back as 1840. This is an urban studies kind of classic in literature. The short story Man of the Crowd from 1840 takes place in London, although he was probably describing Baltimore because he never quite made it to London. But just understanding that the experience of the city, urbanism, the social and physical experience of cities was jarring, disorienting, and anonymous. And he writes about the wild effects of the light that enchained him to an examination of individual faces and the kind of fast-moving experience. I mean, in this case, he observes, the narrator from inside a cafe observes a man of the crowd. He ends up following the man of the crowd through the spaces of the city itself. But the message is that the city is jarring and disorienting, and that we make a lot of quick decisions based on visuality when we're in the city. This is 1840. I mean, jumping to 1905, one of the great social theorists of the city, Georg Simmel, wrote a still incredibly influential essay called The Metropolis and Mental Life, in which he explicitly talks about the psychological basis of what he calls the metropolitan type of person, and that the attributes of the metropolitan type is someone who is attempting to acclimate to the intensification of nervous stimulation, which results, Simmel writes, from the swift and uninterrupted change of outer and inner stimuli. I just show these pictures of August Sander from the 1920s, just in terms of thinking about how artists and observers are trying to describe the multiplicity of urban society at that time. Simmel writes that we respond with the head instead of the heart. And again, he also emphasizes visuality in the urban experience. But the idea that Simmel is saying is that we form a kind of carapace ourselves, or attempt to, as we acclimate to the intensity of urban experiences. And one way I think of understanding, or the way I'm kind of understanding neurodivergence from my perspective, is the degree to which we make that acclimation, and how to account for the differences or the degrees to which we're able to do that. You know, the film in Symphony of a Great City from 1929 also brings out the issues around stimulation, anonymity, labored discipline, inequality, and ultimately violence as being aspects of the urban experience. And it may be conceived of as a kind of symphony, but it's a symphony with a lot of dissonance, in which overstimulation and discipline characterize the life of the city itself. There have been many responses, artistic and architectural responses to the stimulation or perceived chaos of the urban environment, from Joseph Stella's kind of celebration, perhaps, of the rights of Coney Island, this kind of wild evocation of urban overstimulation, to the Swiss-French architect and urbanist Le Corbusier, who thinks about the intensity in terms of congestion and really wanting to destroy it. He's saying we have to destroy the corridor street and eliminate the kind of intensity of that sort of urban environment. The solution would be to start anew, clear it out, separate functions of the city, and try to eliminate some of that dissonance in everyday life. We've had very dramatic proposals along those lines, as many of you know, right here in New Haven. An acolyte of Le Corbusier, Maurice Rodival, puts together this plan for southwest area of New Haven. You can see there's not much of the city left. But it shows an incredible disenchantment with, again, the perceived chaos, congestion, dissonance, and overstimulation of the city itself, and attempting to use these dramatic and really violent means to attempt to discipline that. I'm also showing Le Corbusier's modular image because it does relate in some sense to universal design. I mean, he, in a utopian way, thought that he could design for a universal person, and whether or not there was a kind of blind spot there in imagining that person ever even existed. And finally, I wanted to bring us back to a couple of kind of interesting takes and thinking of I kind of connect to some of this, not only at the scale of the building, but the scale of the city, finding orientation and understanding that we all live in our own psychogeographic worlds, that there are psychological atmospheres in the city that may have their own kind of logic or unity. I mean, that's partly what the Situationists in art group 1950s Paris were trying to evoke in their image of the naked city, that the psychological experiences of the city may or may not correspond with the actual map of the city itself, or Kevin Lynch's efforts to really break down our visual experience of the city and wanting to provide meaningful wayfinding and orientation devices, and really studying individual people and how they perceive the city itself. And just to close these brief kind of introductory thoughts on this, thinking about this building itself and its relationship to the street, which we've already begun to kind of discuss, and Stuart gave some of his own thoughts about this yesterday. I'm actually curious what the CBA is gonna think about the Chapel Street going two-way. And part of the Chapel Street going from one way to two-way is actually to calm the traffic of the street and to make it hopefully a little bit less maybe high speed. We'll see how that actually plays out. But what Kahn does in such an interesting way, the architect Luke Kahn, he cuts away the corner. You have this quasi-public refuge from the street. You can really calm down and be in this space apart from the street. Then you open the door, this thin membrane, and you're in this epic space, which is awe-inspiring and can also be a little bit intimidating, and it brings your heart rate up again. And it's one reason why I love the Hugh Locke installation that's there now. It's wonderful and fascinating because it breaks down the scale of that room and almost domesticates it in a way that I find very comforting, actually. And when it's not there, you really are into this new kind of world. It's wonderful to think about how different elements can break down those spatial experiences. So just a few kind of thoughts, maybe from an urban studies perspective on some of our topics.
Thanks. So I will try to jump through quickly with my slides because I think some of the meaning of them will kind of come out in our conversation, but just wanted to get some kind of visuals across. So one of the key things to my work is we have these big industrial knitting machines in my lab. So it lets us design textiles from scratch. So in the context of a larger discussion, it gives this idea of what is designable. And if all facets of a material are designable, then you can design with an incredible amount of intention. So fit, color, size, softness, hardness, something you can unroll like a sock because that's a very satisfying process. Tactility, all of these things become exposed through the fact that we can choose a yarn, we can choose the color of the yarn, we can change that yarn, we can mix it with other yarns, we can knit it to a certain texture, we can knit that texture at a certain scale. So it allows us to kind of explore how environment can be variable within sort of one space or one object or one environment. And then how that variability can produce, within a kind of, community that we know is diverse, produce, excitement across that community. So as I mentioned, has to do with my daughter and the environments that she likes. So really kind of the concept, hopefully that's big enough for you, kind of tries to follow this idea, and I had a great conversation over lunch about this, that design should not be about neutralizing an environment. So that's kind of the argument that is often had. Let's, in terms of the stimulation of an environment, let's just make sure we're removing the detrimental parts so that it doesn't have influence in a negative way on a behavioral outcome. I think that's wrong. I think that's the wrong approach. And as evidence in the experience with my daughter, if there's the right stimulation that is found, and if you are a participator in that stimulation, then it becomes beneficial, sometimes extra beneficial, in terms of overcoming some of the challenges, in terms of the needs of developing communication and learning and engagement and so on. So as an example, no, we did not stuff her in the suitcase. She very much chose that. So this was a part of a therapy program we did called the Play Project, where the idea is building circles of communication where you're interacting while completely ensconced within a preferred sensory enriched experience. So yes, she likes the compactness of the suitcase, but it's really the fact that we can wheel it around. And then she can communicate and she gets that agency to say forward, backward, inside, outside, slow, fast, on the rocks, on the carpet, on the floor. So that becomes that sensory activator becomes the tool that becomes the trigger to activate communication. And as a parent with a nonverbal child, one who's very young, it's very hard to develop that communication and very hard for the child to understand that she can communicate, that is, means to interact with somebody. Yeah, this may be too long to describe, but just talking about how sensory interaction can occur. So My daughter loves riding around in the car. She loves it so much, I've argued, like, why can't therapy, the classroom, just happen in the car? Why do we have to take her out of the car? So it's, the sensory experience is bounded, it's completely encompassing. The other one might be maybe you, with a certain frequency, you go to the sensory swing and then you engage in an activity and then you go back to the swing and that kind of resets your regulation and then you go back to an activity. So it's not completely involved, but it is a part of the schedule. And then the other might be just distributed. Just everything is kind of retrofit or considered with its kind of tactility, its sensory nature as a part of the design. So just showing some projects of different scales. So kind of soft, stretchy, visual, graphically interactive environments. My daughter and her agency of like, okay, I might want to be upside down or do a face plant. But I think, again, the scale, right? The scale of the body on the left versus the scale of like feeling the mesh on the teeth, the teeth, the lips, the tongue, as being like a preferred interaction at that moment. Something that's a big environment but breaks down into something very small. I have sort of a little sample of what's happening on the left. We call it the unraveler. So it's like undoing a knit, which I don't know, generally, I think we've been about 100% hit rate that when everybody tries it, they like it. So having these, small moments and small features within something that might be a bigger environment. This was a project, outdoor exploration at the Big Umbrella Festival at Lincoln Center. Taking that project to another festival that was in Omaha, the Common Senses Festival. And then doing, just provoked by some of the conversation this morning, doing some participatory design. So I'm designing all these other projects, of course, with input from my daughter and kind of, understanding her environment and others like her. But, it's like, at the end of the day, I kind of don't want to be the designer. So how much can she be a part of it, making the environment, and the fact that she has a hand in the environment, does that make it more engaging? Does that make it more, giving her more kind of agency? And I guess I liked the self-determination, so it was mentioned earlier today. And then some of the more detailed research we're getting into is working with the autism community, working with autistic adults, working with caregivers and service providers, and just seeing these different scales of interaction that can happen, starting to get their feedback on, what's valuable, what's interesting, is high-tech interesting, is low-tech interesting, is loud and clicky valuable, or is soft and discreet and I can stuff it in my pocket more valuable, or what are the different circumstances? So we're, kind of approaching the project, starting with the community first to really help us outline the directions of research, and then wanting to explore metrics for how we can understand the effects of a sensory environment on the influence of behavior and emotion. And I think it's the last one. I'll leave it there.
Great. Thank you all.
Quick one. Do I click or go? Okay.
That's good.
Which one? Do we want certain backdrop?
I don't think it matters. So maybe I can ask a few questions. One thing I'd be curious about, we've heard, this is a symposium on neurodivergence, and we've heard about it from a personal perspective. The panel this morning talked about it in the context of education. In thinking about space and design, how do you define neurodivergent, and does it require a different or a special definition when we're thinking about physical space?
You want to start?
Oh, okay. I mean, I would have many perspectives on that, I guess. I think maybe the one thing, coming back to what Stuart said yesterday, the idea of the chaos actually being valuable because you can do your own thing within the chaos and you're allowed to do your own thing within the chaos. So to me, defining neurodivergence, maybe from a selfish perspective, I want to use the creativity of my daughter to enhance the designs that I generate. But that idea that like, I'm interested in neurodivergence through architecture as a way for it to be a medium that expresses individual creativity. Because I think, I mean, you know, even with the broader disability, when you have something that interacts with the environment in a non-normative way, you are going to be creative. Some get very tired of having to be creative, but you are going to be creative. And I think a lot of times that creativity is like pretty astounding. So that's the sort of, I guess, kind of dream of how I would define neurodivergence as being meaningful towards design.
I'm happy to go next. So one of the things I just want to make note of is that neurodiversity is a term that was chosen by people with lived experience. This wasn't imposed by anybody. This is really born of biodiversity, which is a celebration of natural diversity in nature. And it's this idea of brains that work differently is worthy of celebration. And I think that is a critically important thing to keep in mind. This wasn't imposed from outside. People embrace this identity. And in our work, we find that, you know, we assume a fairly broad definition. We start with things that we use to segment, you know, so that dyslexia and dyscalculia, very common, the most common reason for childhood disability for decades now. And then we go on to ADHD, and there we have, you know, we're looking at about 10% of people with dyslexia. And God knows the range is enormous. And then ADHD, you know, and ADHD has been a very big phenomenon. And again, thinking about culture and about diagnosis and how screwy all of that is in terms of old patterns. And I'm sure you know, kids of color, particularly Black kids, have been diagnosed with behavioral health disorders and drugged when indeed it is more likely they were ADHD or autism. And, you know, this is something that, you know, we've only had significant peer-reviewed research only in the last few years that basically says, oh my God, what have we done? And then we look at autism. And, you know, we've been working on autism projects as being consultants on built environment projects since 1999. And I look back at how ignorant we were. At that moment in time, and I'm talking about projects we're dealing with the Media Lab at MIT, and we're all saying, well, 2/3 of people with autism have intellectual limitations. It was baloney. You know, it runs about 20% total of all the people diagnosed with autism. And of course, the madness of the current world saying, oh, it's exploded in this epidemic. And in truth, it's just a change in the diagnostic and statistical manual. It's not, you know, it's not an epidemic. So that's how we define it. And I have to say that we work very closely with a lot of self-advocacy organizations around the nation and the world. And one of the things that I'm watching, and this is, you know, I've had a long career in dealing with mental reasons for disability. It has been that arc that I care desperately about, partly because it has gotten such short shrift. And now people with psychiatric disabilities, and I so appreciate Stuart talking last night about being involuntarily committed before he actually got an accurate diagnosis. And then I find out that my cohort and staff member had exactly the same reason a generation later. You know, the horror of forced mental health treatment turns out to be just an evidence of how much we don't understand. Now people with psychiatric disabilities, whether it's anxiety or depression or bipolar illness, only occasionally schizophrenia, but it's a big crowd on the mental health side, say, I want to be understood as being neurodiverse. I want to be part of a crowd that is not ashamed, that actually is empowered and has hope and intends to call the shots. And I think that is a phenomenal asset of neurodivergence. And I think it's one that we should applaud.
Yeah, I find both of those responses really inspiring. I think that it would be one of the maybe pitfalls of discussing it is that it feels binary. You either are or you are not neurodivergent. And that would seem to be a kind of mistake, considering how many forms of difference it can represent in this kind of multi-dimensional spectrum of all variety. I guess what I'm coming around to seeing it as an outlook or a perspective that is about accessibility and inclusivity in as radical a way as is possible, as opposed to it being like a kind of fact necessarily. It's almost more like an approach. And I think it's a totally essential. And the more that designers and urban planners can learn about specific needs, I think is terrific and important. But maybe even more than that, it's just getting away and thinking about designing, whether they're cities or streets or buildings, for some kind of universalized neural norm in some sense. Yeah, I guess that's how I would come to describe it, as much an approach as it is a kind of attribute, I suppose.
If I could jump in on that, it's such an important point, and I think it's really important for people to understand that we only require a diagnosis in K through 12. That's an American norm. That's what the law requires, that you have a diagnostic determination of whether you have this thing, and you are then designated as a person with a disability. That all goes away when you graduate from high school. So that idea of what do college students do? What do people in the workforce do? Well, I got to tell you, they don't self-identify. Some of them do if they've got a specific way in which they can get an accommodation. But it is a minority. We work extensively in higher ed and in the corporate world. Microsoft has had a disability-friendly, welcoming attitude for a decade. Worked really hard at it. They have an incredibly diverse staff. In terms of disclosure, they're only running 8% disclosure. And that's because people just know it's too risky. And in college, we are dealing with, more and more schools are saying, they're going to self-identify because there is less stigma. That neurodivergence is something that people feel more comfortable with, but the overwhelming majority don't disclose. That if we think it's only about them over there that have disclosed, we're missing the majority.
There's a saying in autism, if you've seen one person with autism, you've seen one person with autism, right? And here we're talking about autism and ADHD and visual differences, hearing differences. How do you even come at it? Like, how does one think about designing a space that could be a fit for so many different kinds of people? Avoiding stimulation, seeking stimulation. Like, where do you start?
I kind of want to throw it to James, because I think what you're presenting is so interesting. I think there is a kind of conventional wisdom if doing research around this topic. It is about cocooning in one form or another. There's a tremendous amount of writing about that there should be places of retreat, ways of cocooning, of being able to get away from stimulation. You're suggesting a different approach, which is much more exciting and welcoming and inviting of different forms of stimulation and getting out of the cocoon. And so I feel like there's not one approach right now or one answer.
Yeah, and I would say the challenge is how do you determine if you're designing the right thing? So we can develop an informed approach, but because I've run into this challenge, it's almost become a kind of impasse with my work. Is I can only understand it by getting it out into the world, right? This isn't lab work. It's useless to do it just in the lab. It has to be out in the world, and people interacting with it and figuring out how to gather feedback from it to make the next version better. But it means it's highly experimental. So how do you get something out in the world that's highly experimental with an audience that people are going to be very delicate with, generally speaking, and gather data in a meaningful way? I haven't necessarily discovered the relationship where that works, because often it has been, museums have called me up and said, hey, we want to, have one of your designs in here. They look so cool, and you show kids interacting with it. And then I show up and there's still some rough edges, and we threw a new idea in there because we wanted to test it out and see if it has any validity, if it can withstand wear and tear over the span of a day or whatever. And they're not so happy with that. When they have something in their museum, in their children's museum, another kind of museum, they want a polished piece of work. Well, I'm not going to polish it until I'm convinced that it's the right thing to polish. So it's kind of this, chicken or the egg, really challenging moment of it's got to get out into the world, but where are the venues that you have the opportunity to actually do that?
So let me talk about how we practice this, because we do consulting and design services in many different portfolios. So museums is one. We're on 105th museum in the last decade alone. So this is always a topic in museums. It's an enormous topic in our higher ed work. It's a topic in our public transit work, a significant topic. And I want to make sure that the crowd is aware that though the United States is behind in having standards and guidelines on this, the world is not without anything. My colleagues in England developed Design for the Mind in 22. Stuart, you must know that guide. Do you? It's a BSI guide. What do you think of it? I know you're not mic'd, but I agree. I agree, but it's better than anything we have here. It's better than nothing. And just as an explanation about that.
Do you want to repeat his response?
Stuart said, it's better than nothing, and it's not bad. And I think that's where we are, but we're 3 years out from it. I'm actually going to have the woman who's the author, primary author of it, speaking in a global webcast in December, and I will share that with Linda so she can let people know. But I think we pay attention to that. We do peer-reviewed research, much of it coming from neuroscience, about what works and what doesn't, and what kinds of things matter. And then we do direct research, particularly on individual places. So it is very tailored to the client. And we call that's part of contextual inquiry. It is this context, we're trying to understand what happens at the intersection of people in this particular place. And that delivers an extraordinary amount of insight about what's working, what's failing, and what people think will work better. And that, in many ways, it's the juice that keeps us going. And I'm happy to report that we've got clients from coast to coast that actually pay for that as part of a scope of work. We're not imposing it on anybody. And that is thrilling. We've done that across the street at the Yale Art Gallery. And it was an extraordinary opportunity with people in 4 sessions over 2 days, including people who are neurodiverse. And they saw things that we never saw in an analysis, a close analysis of both the opportunity for compliance and inclusive design. We had new ideas.
I would be really curious about hearing more about an example from transport and mobility, for example, because it occurs to me that the time you get to the museum, you've already accomplished something. I mean, just navigating from wherever you live to getting there. And there's a lot of friction and obstacles around the way. Maybe transport in particular. I mean, when I'm visiting an unfamiliar city, I want to research how it works so that I can use the bike share or I can use the metro and figure out how to do it and reduce those barriers or that friction or that sense of confusion and frankly, that sense of stress. There's a tremendous amount of stress associated with mobility. And anything that can be done to reduce those forms of stress would certainly be helpful so that you can at least be delivered to the front of the museum in as comfortable a way as possible. So I don't know, Valerie, if something comes to mind.
Well, let me use a couple of things. One is predictability. We recently did a study with user experts in Boston on our 150 miles of new bike lanes. And it was about the safety of people with disabilities and older people in relation to those bike lanes. And it was eye-opening. Partly what made people wild is that there was no predictability. There's 16 different designs. So you learn something on this part of town, and it's completely different over here. So you never feel safe because you don't know what to expect. One of the other things that we've been working on is night lighting.
Yeah.
And what drives the policies on night lighting is, of course, environmental sustainability, very important in night lighting, until it conflicts with people's sense of safety and security in stations that are open to the darkness. And then you find out, no, we actually need to really think about light and where that light comes from and how it actually delivers a sense of confidence to people that I am safe.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, predictability to me seems incredibly important. It's becoming more and more common in many cities that you will know when the bus is coming, you will know when the train is coming. I find that to be incredibly stress reducing to know that, as opposed to showing up and not. And so those things I think are becoming more and more common because what is helpful and stress reducing for those who identify or are neurodivergent is also helpful for the rest of us too.
And I think in many ways, that's exactly the point that makes this whole conversation over these 2 days so important, is that every one of us knows our brains work differently from one day to the next. That we may have an arc that indicate, some people have substantial functional limitations, but we are all vulnerable. I was so exhausted yesterday because it's been a very long stretch of many weeks without a break. And twice in the course of the day, I misplaced my hotel room keys and they had to replace them. That's like, oh my God, what do they think of me? But we're all like that. I mean, it's the lousy flight that kept you waiting for 8 hours, or it's the child who was up all night. It is any number of things that really rattle our functional ability to think.
Yeah. You make a good point, Valerie, about, we can think about heterogeneity across different kinds of people, but even within a person, there's tremendous heterogeneity from day to day. And when we talk about a space working or not working, it implies a certain passivity, that a space is static and people are passive recipients of it. Is there potential, when we think about the kinds of diversity we're talking about, to be thinking about spaces that are active, in which people engaging with them can be agents? But maybe it's not a dark space or a light space, but it's both, depending on who needs what. How do you think about that in terms of space and neurodivergence?
James, you want to jump in on that first?
Yeah, I guess not necessarily specifically, but sure, the design of the environments or the designs that we try to pursue is that everything is multifunctional, everything is adaptable, is the holy grail, at least, of what we try to pursue with the designs that we create. Even if it's the small thing, it can be very open and active, or I can just have it in my pocket and do the same kind of thing and very discreet. I think one of the larger questions that I have is, that might be trying to find the right level of, sensory input that helps, maybe calm, helps better hold a conversation. But maybe if perhaps you're just offered some form of agency, it might not be the right kind of agency, but that also has a kind of beneficial trigger to it as well. I certainly don't have the answer to that, but I'm very curious about that. Certainly in the life of my daughter and certainly other people I know with a disability, their level of agency is incredibly muted, right? There's via social expectations, or just the fact that, the way you're educated is a very structured way, right? With ABA therapy, right? That the task changes every 10 to 15 minutes. And I swear my daughter built an internal bell that we had to break down over time, that she just expected to have somebody tell her, what am I doing next at 15 minutes? And would get anxious if she wasn't, told that next task. So the idea that you can learn agency, and then that any agency perhaps, so any kind of freedom to change the environment by your own hands, maybe is enough to be able to regain composure in something where you feel like it's kind of all coming at you.
That's so interesting, because there's a famous study from around 1980, many of you will know, by William H. White, The Social Life of Small Urban Spaces. There are many anachronistic elements to that project, but one of the things that he comes up with, looking at places like Paley Park in New York, people love to be able to make even the smallest agent manipulation of the chair. They'll pick up the chair and move it an inch. It's functionally the same thing, but even the movement is more comfortable and having some kind of agency. And then he shows these other public places in New York where the seats are very rigid and fixed, and they're always awkward, and they never seem to work quite the right way. And so I think that balance of the degree of agency is an interesting one, and how to accommodate a certain amount.
I'm just reminded that in all of the campus work that we do, students have a big priority on being able to move things. So you probably know Harvard Yard has had a long-term solution that Michael Van Valkenburg designed years ago. And you can move, the chairs are light enough to move. And there's multiple kinds. There's the type you sort of sit in alone, you sit back, there's little tables. It has a delicious flexibility. We have a number of other schools who are so damn worried about theft of chairs in the out of doors that they put these massive Adirondack chairs. The kids hate them. You can't
Because you can't move.
Don't even shift them. And they will say, you know, people with non-apparent disabilities will say, I can't move that. Under no circumstance. Take 3 of us to move that chair. So these are the kinds of things that give people a sense of control.
Right.
Sense of control is so important to our well-being. And I think we heard some things from Stuart last night about some of the tiny things that are so easy to do. The chair in the corner of that open courtyard. What a gift. And you know, in architecture, prospect and refuge, really old ideas. And they are born of the most primitive needs of the human brain, of any brain. I mean, I think it's rats who actually taught us about prospect and refuge. You got to see where the enemy's coming from, and your back is covered. We still have that need.
The stats you showed today, Valerie, you know, showed like things are changing so dynamically. In fact, the rates are even higher as of a publication in 2025. It's now 3%. What do people who are beginning their careers today in architecture, in the intersection of space and neurodivergence, what's going to be different for them? What advice would you have to the people who are listening, who are starting their careers?
I'm thrilled to have a professor of architecture sitting next to me. Let me give you a little bit of our pitch, because I talk to a lot of architecture students. And I have to tell you, you can argue with me, but there's a pervasive absence of teaching about this in schools of architecture. Ain't done. There's less today than there was 34 years ago, a year after the ADA passed. We have a lot of work to do. One of the things I'd like students to understand is that we get the clients with aspirations to go the distance. What is the state of the art? And those clients are extremely varied. So for instance, certainly museums, higher ed, but we are also working with biomedical institutions and with IT, you know, technology, STEM has turned into a world in which people who are neurodiverse are thriving. You know, our confusion 25 years ago that we didn't think people had, you know, the ability to go to higher ed, to be able to have careers, we were so dead wrong. It's not like, you know, there are people who still need 24/7 care, and we should never forget that, because that is a phenomenon that deserves our full respect and investment. But the reality is that we're seeing people pursue advanced degrees, getting good jobs in STEM, highly paid competitive jobs. What we're being called on to do is, geez, we've got people who we really want to keep, but if we don't create an environment that makes them feel comfortable and in control, they're out of here in 2 years, just about the time when they're useful to us. So we're getting called in by people. The idea that major multinational corporations want to know, how can you design a workspace for me or a lab for me that is going to keep our biggest talent in play? We're also, one of our projects currently is a cancer hospital. And they have a load of people who are neurodiverse, young, middle-aged, old, and they need to figure out how to make them feel as comfortable as possible during treatment. And this is all sort of ambulatory services, and they are lost in terms of what to do. And things like crummy waiting spaces, you know, the patient rooms, the level of exposure for some people, and things like intravenous, where you're sitting for 5 to 7 hours. If that environment doesn't give you a sense of comfort and control, you're in trouble. And they know that. So for designers to understand, this is a deeply creative opportunity in a time when clients want to find architectural firms that have this in their portfolio, and they're not finding it now.
Right.
That would seem attractive to me.
I totally agree. And Valerie, we are absolutely going to integrate this into the School of Architecture. Because I think that it has, in some instances, the ADAs become boxes to check off.
Have you ever met a designer that loved that idea?
Supposed to really leaning into it, and James, I think you're really modeling this as an incredible opportunity, and one that ultimately has its own justification even for a corporate bottom line. The only thing I would add to that in terms of what we, at least in the urban design studio that I teach, what I try to emphasize, I think many of the instructors do, is design is not static. You never experience a building as a building. It's all buildings, and it's all about mobility. You're always moving through spaces, moving to spaces. And so how do we imagine and design around itineraries, and as diverse a set of itineraries as possible? And some of that involves speculative empathy, maybe, and some of it does and should involve real research and focus groups and interviews and discussions around understanding those itineraries.
And remember that contextual definition of disability, not focus groups, which tend to highlight the biggest personalities in the room, but observing deeply, what do people do at the intersection of the environment?
Right.
Because that's where the real gold is.
Yeah.
I think it's,
And then we'll go to questions.
okay. I mean, I think there's some bigger challenges, but I mean, to me, it comes down to really design process. I mean, I think, the design as well, I guess, in terms of the work that we try to do, and what I'm interested in is, and what I realize, like, I can't create the narrative of my daughter's life. Like, I should not be standing in her shoes. I don't have that right. I don't have that knowledge. She has to create that narrative. I have to try and create an environment where she can do that. And I think it's the same with design. Design struggles because the architect feels the need and has the ego to shape the narrative. This is what design is about. I've created it for you. And those don't work. As I said with the question last night, like when you just plop a slide in the middle of a playground, if you don't use it like a slide, it's not okay. You've broken the rules. So how design can have the ability to allow other narratives, I think is critical. I think that can only be generated through thoughtful design process or different kinds of design process. What we've been working, or what was introduced to me through a collaborator in kinesiology, is what they call patient in the loop design, which can mean many different things. And there are ones that are not appropriate, but there's ones that can be kind of reconfigured to work for architecture. And kind of going beyond the focus group, the idea that you are gathering that information about the lived experience, but you're also figuring out how that, not only just like, okay, gives us a couple ideas of we need to use white colors and quiet rooms, but how do you carry these discussions on throughout the design of the project? My colleague in kinesiology really uses it to shape research. Have we even asked the right base question about what this research should be about? And then, of course, as you develop it, like, are we touching the right points? Do we have the right people in the room? So it's really, I mean, this is why I've always been involved in architecture and kind of gone the more academic route. I like designing the design process. And that's exactly what this needs, this needs research of the design process that can research design process to then exploit that design process to produce design. So it's a pretty elaborate, many layers of thinking, but to me, that's how, architecture changes. But that can happen ubiquitously, that's a tall task for sure. But I suppose through those moments where it can happen, if that can provide learnings that can then grow more ubiquitously into how we think about design, that might be the other way that it works.
Shall we, are there any questions from the audience, either online or in vivo?
Nobody?
Thank you so much for that really exciting presentation. Sean, I'm really captivated by the joy that comes through in your project. And I'm very interested in learning more about the kind of data that you do collect and how you collect that data, because it seems like there's so many questions that you might be asking. Thank you.
The honest answer is we're trying to figure out how to collect the data now. But I mean, it's certainly, you know, in terms of what architects are trained for, we're obviously not trained to how to study human behavior. I'd say the lowest entry or the easiest entry point has been working with kinesiology, working with people who are focused on movement, but for the purposes of understanding how autistic individuals' movement is influential to, you know, social interaction, to something that might communicate behavior, i.e. stimming, something like that. So that we've done a little bit of that. You know, we did through video capture, just look at one of these environments and see what are the myriad of different ways in which children interacted with it. And my curiosity was, you know, in these different pockets of space, you know, what are the different ways in which one pocket of space could be activated, could be functionalized essentially. So does it have that agency? And there was somehow in this one design, this one little space that somebody wanted to climb through it like it was a jungle gym. Somebody else wanted to sit there and just touch it, you know, with their fingers and their face. So we just through video kind of sampled, and sure enough, across the body from head to toe and butt and everything, this one space had some sort of interaction along the way. So that was one of the ways in which we measured things. But now to kind of like link it to emotion, link it to its capability to, you know, improve emotion and so on. That's the next step, like working with psychologists, social research, social science, things like that. People like that.
Another question?
So I want to ask Valerie, there seems to be an elephant in the room here. You've mentioned it a couple of times. It's called anxiety.
Yes.
And you seem to be working with that with your clients. But I wonder, I mean, whether it's with children, ADHD is one of the examples. I mean, what comes first, the ADHD or the anxiety or the learning disorder? And what about PTSD? We know about it in adults who's experienced obvious, severely disturbing things. But what about kids in terms of their early development, non-communication, things like that? So how do you deal with that with clients?
Doctor, that's really a really important point that hasn't come up yet in this event. And I think there is a relationship between trauma and a lot of what we're talking about. And that certainly has something to do with PTSD and with anxiety. And it is extraordinarily pervasive. And I think in the work that we've done, you know, working with Design for Incarcerated Youth, my God, the trauma reality for those young people is bordering 100%. That's just a reality. And design has an enormous potential impact. And I think we are still at a fairly early stage. When we work in higher ed, particularly with big universities, we're also finding, you know, the reality of the veteran population in higher ed is also really interesting. So they are twice as likely to self-identify as having a disability as the rest of the student population. And that represents a terrific opportunity for learning. They tend to be older students, but both in the undergraduate and the graduate level, they are a gold mine of insight as to what they need to be successful. No great answers, but I think we're seeing more people who are doing work in trauma-informed design. And I think we need to do some melding and stirring about of what would work. Does that make sense to you? Thank you.
Now, I also want to just mention, I'm going to, on behalf of Sean, we're all invited to his lab to experience the beautiful structures that we saw today. So, yeah.
15-minute break and resume at 2:45. Welcome back, everyone. If you could please take your seats. I am delighted to welcome you back for our final panel this afternoon. And I'm going to turn it right over to our chair, Maggie Cernak.
All right. Thank you all so much for joining us today and for staying for our final panel. I'm absolutely delighted to be joined here today by our three very esteemed panelists who I'm going to ask to introduce themselves briefly before we get into the subject material.
Hi, I'm Laura Nadine. I'm on the spectrum. I'm one of the people you're all here for. And I'm wondering if the center seats are lava because nobody wants to touch them.
Hi, Erin Friedlander. Most importantly, I'm the mom of an autistic child who sort of motivates much of what I do in terms of paving an easier way forward for him. I'm a practicing ER physician and okay, Mom, I'll talk louder. And in the work that I do, I was recognizing that in the children in crisis I care for and in watching my own son moderate environments, there was a missing piece between us understanding the kinds of affordances and barriers that might be available and trying to understand those better. And then in trying to understand why we have made enormous efforts to create these very anemic, muted environments for kids who might not be doing quite as well there. I was trying to reconcile the prevailing design paradigms with what I was seeing and found that there's really not a robust evidence base for why we have decided to make certain choices, even though they're very well intended. And I think a pivotal moment was when I was with my exceptionally lovely friend Stuart in Copenhagen, and he was sharing an example of his beloved Cork city that had tried to be inviting to individuals in wheelchairs, and they spent a significant amount of money placing 5 different wheelchairs in the city of Cork for people who are in wheelchairs, where you slide the wheelchair onto this large contraption and it lets you swing. But they positioned these swings in a way that the back of the individual swinging was facing the rest of play areas. And it was a very visual and specific separation of these individuals who had a disability from the rest of the world that was sort of enjoying space. And from a public health investigator lens, I was recognizing that people just aren't imposing any kind of study or inquiry to the things that we're doing. And if they had asked what the intention for that kind of intervention was, is it just to let people know what it feels like to swing? And if so, then they did great. But if it was really to try to include more people into that space and feel welcome, it didn't sort of meet that mark. And I've been trying in the last 6 or 7 years to build interdisciplinary teams and act sort of as a translator between architects and designers to be able to ask questions in a more scientific way so that we can be intentional about the things that we build and make sure that the things that we amplify and share and replicate are actually having the outcomes that our population of interest would really like.
Amazing. My name is Sarah Rottenberg. I lead a master's program in integrated product design at the University of Pennsylvania, where we bring students from design, engineering, and business backgrounds through an interdisciplinary human-centered design process. And I also have several other roles, and over that time, I've really been kind of moving my design practice and the design process that I'm teaching from a perspective of designing for to a perspective of co-design. And so over the last several years, with the help of Erin and Stuart and several other experts, I've been running these kind of co-design studios around design for accessibility, equity, and inclusion. And the last 3 years, we've been focusing on designing for and with neurodivergent individuals. And so I have students from architecture, from urban planning, from landscape architecture, from biomedical design, mechanical engineering, and product design. And really kind of trying to engage in this project where they decenter themselves from the design process, bring other people with lived experience into the design process, and really ask themselves, what does it look like to really collaborate in a design process? And so I am still, I would say, like, I don't really feel like an expert in this. I'm learning as I go with collaborators and with our students, but really my hope is that more students will graduate with this perspective and then bring that forward as they go into practice and become leaders of design.
Thank you. So one of the things that we were sort of hoping to do today is have a lot of opportunities to engage with the audience. So you'll see that our panel is structured a little bit differently. I think one of the common themes amongst ourselves is that I don't know that any one of ourselves considers us as the experts in this topic. But we are really here as people who have deep learners. And you know, do you are you a bioethicist on a panel? So I think that when we were talking about this, we were such deeply invested in sort of inquiry and learning from one another and with you all. And I have been struck over the past 2 days to really have been exposed to such wonderfully range of ideas and concepts that have, I think, really challenged me to think differently. And so we want to sort of continue that. And I will say that as I come to this panel, as somebody who has a deep investment in sort of ideas about health and well-being and how environments shape our senses and feelings of that. And my background is in history and sociology of science. So despite my title, I'm not a physician, so I do not come with any sort of medical expertise in that way, but rather with sort of a deep curiosity about the ways in which different sort of frameworks might help expose new ways of seeing and new ways of engaging. And so to that end, one of the things that I have been struck by is the number of times certain terms have come up over the past 2 days. So things such as social justice has come up often, access, equity, self-determination, autonomy, agency. And all of these are really central concepts within sort of ethical discussions and ethical frameworks. And Stuart, I found it really compelling last night when you were talking about the ways in which travel sometimes can help make our home environments actually seem a little bit strange. The things we don't notice and that we take for granted because we are surrounded by them continuously, we stop questioning. And sometimes that experience of traveling outside of those spaces allows us to see things as not being so normal. And so what we're sort of hoping to achieve today is to think about whether or not it is the case that does design ethics sort of give us a framework or a perspective that really allows us to make the things that seem normal in our environments, and specifically within art museums. Does it actually help us to see the things that we take for granted or as normal and actually make them a little bit strange? And help us to sort of question that and what design choices are we making? So in terms of what we are going to be doing, this is a little bit of our outlines and goals for today. We're really hoping that we will be able to discuss, like, what do we mean by design ethics? How can we bridge some of those concepts that we've been discussing into actions that we can take? What we found even from our initial discussions is that we were having some really tough conversations, and that there were these productive tensions that were coming up, and we were immediately trying to sort of, I think, come to terms with, like, are we doing this? Are we asking the right questions? And what about this? So we expect that it might not always be an entirely comfortable conversation, but we really would like to hear from you and invite you to sort of push us in our thinking and engage with us in this process. So we're going to start with some questions for the panelists. First, I was hoping you would speak to us a little bit about how do you think about sort of design ethics or ethical design, and what does that look like for you in your experiences or in your practices?
First, I can go first. I do think that, like, when I think about design ethics, I do think about the questions that we ask, and I think about design ethics and design justice. And so one of the questions as a designer is, you know, what are we designing, and what is it affording, and what is it disaffording for people, and how are we enabling or disabling people through our design? Who are we designing with and for? And then how can we design to create the world that we want to be living in? And I think that raises this question of, like, who is the we, right? And so I think it's about asking these sometimes challenging questions, finding
engaging in conversations with a much broader set of stakeholders around design to develop answers to those questions. That's how I think about like an ethical practice of design.
I sort of have three parallel thoughts when I think about this question, and I'm old enough that I had to write them down to remember them. One of them is this use of the word autism friendly, and I struggle with that a lot. I am so appreciative of everybody here and all of those that are out there trying to bridge this enormous gap between what we haven't had and what we need. But the language around friendly seems a little bit diminishing when we want actual true accommodation, availability, and use of spaces. So when I think about justice, it's not just about friendly, it's a lot more engagement. And I consider that part of an ethics lens on how we design environments. Perhaps most importantly is having genuine co-design. And I have sort of stood on the shoulders of Stuart for this for so long now, and it's such a joy. But you know, he sees things that I don't, and he helps me understand the way he experiences space, and that is genuine co-design. And looking at his images and then trying to pull together engineers and urban planners and architects means that we're looking at his environment as data so that we can make change. And to me, that's a huge part of ethical design. And I think the last thing, which is something my wonderful friend Laura said, is the beauty of this conference around museums is that we aren't meant to simply make spaces like schools and hospitals accessible, but the places that bring joy and engagement and fulfillment should be, you know, primary targets of what we do as well. So I think that's what I think about, Maggie, when you ask me that question.
I think ethical design means that it's not an N of one argument, taking away from average people so that people with disabilities can have. I think it's something that broadens our definition. So like if I'm sorry, I've been teaching 32 years, so I only know how to do this through stories. If I wanted to get a beanbag from here to the top of the stairs, right, I'm going to want to build a bridge of people from here to there, and not just go, okay, here you go, and hope I hit, right? And I think a lot of times when we're talking about ethical design and we're talking about disability inclusive spaces, there's the people with disabilities and there's everybody else making the decisions, and they're like, hey, how's this? And tossing it to us. I start feeling like Oliver Twist. May I have some more, sir? But being a part of the conversation, like you were talking about at the top, being somebody that's maybe the architect or advising the architect or part of the design, or even the artist being shown at the museum so that the people with disabilities want to come and see something that they're represented in and have that conversation is really important. But I think the part that we always miss is how does this affect adults on the autism spectrum or adults with intellectual disabilities? We've talked a lot today about hands-on experiences, and we've seen pictures of kids and coloring and stuff like that. And I think that's great. I'm the parent of someone on the spectrum too, so I totally get it. I just before anybody gets angry. But as an adult on the spectrum, I might want to have a conversation about the art and what it represents. I was just in Italy over the summer. It was actually a lot of fun, and we went and saw the Medici family collection. And apparently they were really enthralled with this little person who had dwarfism, and he's in all their paintings writing on a turtle. And I could hear people going, oh, that's so sad. And I was the only one going, wow, good for him. And the reason I was is because I understood the context of the day and that people like him were left abandoned or starved or maybe even euthanized, right? And while this is not something we see as a great life today, for him, that may have been a fantastic life, that he had food to eat and people that were interested. I would have loved after that museum visit to sit down as a person with a disability with other people and have that conversation. What does this represent to me? And why did that bring me into this space, even though it was a poor representation of what we see as disability today? Mm-hmm. So that is ethical design to me, is how do I continue having a conversation with people on the spectrum
with people with ADHD, with people of all different types of disabilities, and continue that dialogue into future generations. I hope I didn't wrap it too much.
No, not at all. That was wonderful. Before we move on, I would actually, we are going to have some audience participation moments here, but I'd also like to just to invite, because this was such a rich discussion, were there any questions that we had at this point for the panelists about the ways in which ethical design is sort of being thought of, or responses to that? Are we missing something?
You're not being graded.
Rather than the term ethical design, I'm learning that perhaps it should be enabling design, because that's what determines impairment.
Panelists, do you have thoughts on that, the sort of shift?
I don't know. I feel like the language is so tricky.
Yeah.
So there are things I really like about that, and then there are things I really don't love about that. I just found out that you're Aaron's dad, so I can argue with you. Right, because we heard a lot this morning about the importance of agency and self-determination. And so, like, am I trying to enable you, or am I trying to make something available to you so that you can do what you want? I mean, I think it's such a productive and important conversation to think about how do we talk about these things in a way that invites participation, sort of, that doesn't let like me determine how to invite participation, but lets people determine how to participate, I guess.
Yeah, no, I think it's tricky because I think for a while, I can't quantify, the intention of these kinds of initiatives have been to build independence and allow people to be more mobile on their own as they explore communities. But as you talk to many autistic individuals, that's not necessarily what they want. And that independence actually provokes more anxiety. The more we expect of them means the more they have to do and the more demands they have, which is why I'm not sure that we've yet understood what our agenda is as a community. And without really understanding our collective goals, it's really hard to know how to design for that. Is sort of, to me, the words accessible are a problem. Access sometimes to me just means you get in the door, but can you actually have a productive use of space and time there? Available, I don't know that that cultivates a sense of like engagement as we might see it. You know, I don't like universal design because there's always going to be somebody on the ends that's not included in any kind of universal approach. So that's too much of a Pollyanna-ish kind of approach to me. So I struggle with language a lot, and I haven't yet settled on a word, but I like the idea of enabling somebody to be able to do whatever it is that they'd like. So
Well, we're in an academic space. We can make any word sound useless. It just seems to be how it goes. But I think for me, it's not really about making it more accessible. It's just really about getting out of my way. There's so many times where I feel like I'm just hitting a wall that if you would just move, I would be fine with. I'm trying to think of a really, great example to solidify the moment, and my brain has just done a late 40s checkout. So I'm really sorry that I can't give you something really strong to go with. But the last museum experiences I had were in Italy, so I'm going to keep bringing that up. I'm not just trying to brag about going to Italy. And there was a museum in Cremona, Italy called the Museum of the Violin. If you want it in Italian, you can look it up. But what I was impressed with was that you didn't have to go and beg or ask for accessibility. They had it built in a way that just, took our definition from here just a little wider. Does that mean that there's still people on the edges that still aren't being serviced? Maybe, yes. But by broadening the definition just a little bit, by having audio tours included in the price, tactile things to feel. They even had a room where you could smell the wood from the violin. They had Braille. They had all kinds of ways for you to interact. You could listen through this thing and hear all the violins played. You could pull panels out and interact with how they were built. And it's like they thought of everything. And the space was designed in like little villages. And you would just visit the village, but you always had this center space to return to ground and orient. You didn't get lost in a labyrinth of finding your way around like the washrooms here. And I didn't feel like I had to ask for anything as a person with a disability. I felt like, okay, I just felt warmly invited. I can't speak for everybody, but that was my experience.
You've queued up our next slide perfectly, so thank you, Laura.
Good.
I'm actually going to, we wanted to invite the audience to actually think about your sort of perceptions of this space. So not just a space, but this actual auditorium, right? How does it make you feel? And if you scan the QR code with your phone, we'll invite you to. What it will ask you to do is jot down a word. I believe you can submit multiple times. So if you want to submit multiple words, perhaps you may. And just think about, how does this space make you feel?
Cue Jeopardy theme song.
Now I feel like we're like stars because everyone's holding it up.
We can pose like in the artwork.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, this view is not terribly comfortable, the lights shining. Just saying. Oh, see, that's not fair to play music because that's going to change how the
whole
space
feel,
feels.
the whole
Yeah.
vibe.
This space is very responsive.
I feel like those Muppets, the ones that used to criticize the show. That's
Yeah.
nice, yeah. Waldorf and Stadler.
Yes.
Talk about that here.
Oh, nobody has responded yet.
That's not true.
There it goes.
Oh, okay.
Look how big uncomfortable is.
Interesting.
It's kind of interesting how there's a lot of somebody says
Contradiction.
warm and somebody says cold, right? Somebody says smell, and I personally can't appreciate that, but obviously it's important.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think with things like this, it's so interesting to think about, like, you want to look at the commonalities, but that's not necessarily, certainly not the only thing that's important, and probably not the most important, right? The edges, the tensions, the contradictions, the things that maybe one person says, but like if you could have how strongly someone felt it represented in the room, that would be a different map.
Mm-hmm.
Who put the Cambridge word in here? Was it vertiginous?
Oh, yes.
Up the game there.
Good. That's a good word.
So the point is that the same space means different things to different people in the same moment. And that's an important thing to recognize. But I think the other piece of at least what I've done so far in exploring different populations that define themselves by a disability is that there's a lot of things that they have in common as a need, and that brings people together more so than it divides them. There's tremendous overlaps in the things that support the deaf community and that support the neurodivergent community. There's a lot of things that veterans experience in terms of mobility and sensory vulnerabilities that the autism population is also sort of thinking about. And the more you talk to different populations and put them at the center, the more you find these sort of common strengths.
That's interesting. Working in film, I've composed music for film a lot, and we'll put a lot of hard work into all of the visuals and composing the music so it fits perfectly. And then we have to do things like put accessible type at the bottom for it to be read. And it is this horrible black box that sometimes you can't even control where it's placed. I'm not even sure how readable it really is. And so then the discussion becomes, where do you compromise the art for the accessibility? And then everyone gets frustrated. And it's like, we don't want it to be inaccessible. We do want the hard of hearing or the deaf to be able to watch a film and enjoy it. But how do we do that that doesn't pull away from the aesthetic that everybody works so hard to create? And I think that's what we're talking about here with ethical design, is how do we cater to both of those groups and not, you can't please everybody 100%, but there's got to be a better middle.
Yeah.
Well, and I think like if I think about the paradigm of universal design, which I agree is challenging, I think it came out of architecture, right? Where you have to, you can't like, you couldn't, let's say 20 years ago, design a building and expect, there wasn't a sense that like different people could basically experience different buildings within a building, right? But if you're doing like digital design, you could have different modes of a video where it's easily accessible and different for different people to optimize the experience for them. And so thinking about how do we translate that back into buildings and spaces, different pathways, different patterns, where it's not that like one is around the corner, down the back and under the, through the, you know, garbage cans, but they're all desirable pathways that address the needs of different people who are trying to accomplish different tasks or want different things. I don't know. I find that like a good way to think about it, which makes it a really hard design challenge, but also maybe more useful for more people.
And I think one of the things that for me stands out is exactly that there are these kind of divergences, although there's commonalities. And for me, it just brings up so many questions, right? That like sort of when somebody says fun, what is fun? Is it the fact that we're here together having this experience? Is it the room itself? And I think having the ways in which these things are a starting point maybe, right? And that the ways in which we can start the conversation but not end there, that like we did the word cloud, like we checked that box, right? Now we know how you all feel. But instead like using that to sort of like dig deeper into like, what does that mean? Or if somebody wrote burial, like, oh, that for me, like that's an amazing word. And I'm so curious to sort of know more about why it is people have those experiences, and also sort of to check my own sort of assumptions about the way I might be experiencing that, because it opens up doors that I think I didn't even know existed along this corridor. And I think hopefully it invites, I think, more curiosity. All right, so we talked a little bit about the sort of word clouds already, but I'm wondering, sort of, given the theme of this symposium, why do you think it is important for us, and we touched a little bit about this already, to consider design ethics for neurodivergence, specifically as a topic of importance for museums and museum spaces?
I guess I can start. Don't get mad, but art spaces are usually or traditionally considered not necessary, right? I think they're necessary. I totally believe that there should be, you know, symphonies and museums everywhere. But when we talk about accessibility, we always go for things like, how do you get food? How do you get clothing? How do you get shelter? And those are all great things, but we're not talking about how do we enjoy culture? How do we express ourselves? That's part of the autonomy that we're seeking as people with disabilities, is being able to express ourselves, being heard, and not being punished as a result. So I think it is really important for us to talk about this in art museums, a living culture for the future. The changes I'm making now, I might not feel. I mean, that's just the reality of it. I'm getting nearer to 50, and if I work really hard, maybe by the time I'm 80, I'll start seeing some of these changes. It's not for me. It's for the girls growing up now on the spectrum with a disability that had the benefit of the diagnosis early, which I think is great, and will now have a place where they can go and see themselves represented and be able to move comfortably through the space, not in an isolated or segregated disability group, but among the people in the village that they live in.
I've grown up in a home where museums are obviously very important. and having my mother help to really encourage us to use our words to describe what we see and what we feel. And as I try to sort of sit in the middle of interdisciplinary groups and recognize that language doesn't translate across disciplines sometimes, being very deliberate with what you mean is important. So the conversation about education and how we explore environments very intimately and art very intimately when we talk about it in education, to me translates into this kind of how do we build interdisciplinary groups that work well together. I also think museums tend to be really interesting spaces with a lot to talk about, and they're filled with very open-minded people who are rather accepting if we were to think about different sort of community spaces. And it's nice to start in a place where it feels like it's just a collective interest.
Sarah, is there anything you want to add?
No, I think you guys had great answers.
So we wanted to invite the audience to also sort of think with us, and you can either use these questions as prompts. So sort of what benefits or possibilities can you imagine that would result from centering neurodivergent individuals as the model museum visitor? Does that open up new spaces of affordance and connections? What could that look like in concrete terms? And I'm sort of now looking around at the concrete walls. So like an actual sort of physical structure or, sort of ideas. And of course, I would welcome, and we welcome sort of other questions. We promise to leave plenty of time for the sort of questions and the answers. And so we would love to hear from you and continue the conversation.
I feel like everybody right now is actually having kind of an autistic experience because all of you are on the edges. And as someone on the spectrum, I like to be close to an exit in a space where I feel like I can't escape. And we saw earlier tomb or burial or concrete. So it's making me wonder if that's why the middle is so open, is everyone wants the option of getting out.
I think the first question would also make museum staffing look very different. And it would decenter what the workplace itself looks like in a way that would then allow for this question to be answerable.
Can you tell us more about what you mean?
I was thinking about what Jenny was saying earlier about the students she works with and where workplaces, in the nature of the work that's created or expected, allow the thing to happen. I have a family member who is on the spectrum who in a math class said, do you want to know how fast I know the information, or do you want to know that I know the information? He's now a math professor. But for that to be allowed to happen, the expectations around time, around like what kind of work environment do you need to do the work, it has to have an entire cultural shift, which would be wonderful because it would allow so many brilliant contributions to happen and allow this to not be being made for, but being made by.
Thank you. That was terrific. Couple of things. In thinking about ethics in museums and in many other places, but I think there are two things that we at least need to put on the table, and that is respect and humility, which I think are ethical demands of pretty much every environment. But I also think that one of the words that hasn't come up in talking about museums is that museums are the place that we tell our cultural story. And that story needs to be responsive to a more diverse group of visitors. And I think the story piece, in a world in which our stories are being buried every day, is an ethical obligation we all share.
So I noticed that some of our panelists were writing. I want to invite anyone to sort of the panelists to respond to either of those points.
I mean, I think they're related in a way. I think I do think like humility is to me, like the most important thing here. And this idea that we can't really understand anyone else's experience, and the only way to learn what that is like is to have them share what they can. And there's like limitations for what any one of us can do on our own, but if we work together to create that shared story, I think we have more chances of being successful of it telling more than one version of the story. And I guess I was thinking about museums also as like places where, people come and go, and you might run into people from so many other places. They're like really kind of nodes where travelers can kind of bring information to other places. And so they have so much power to spread information and experiences and stories.
Absolutely. And I think, some of what you were saying, Valerie, that was prompting me to keep writing down and reminding myself is how to make sure that we don't include people with this element of tokenism. How is it that we have true, genuine representation and collaboration? And how do we do that without making people have to self-identify if they want to contain their privacy? And those are questions I don't pretend to have the answer to, and I need help understanding that. But that's important to me, that's a big part of how we proceed in any environment around design.
Yeah, I agree with the lack of tokenism, right? I've been there many, many, many times. And I was actually telling Erin when we were in Phoenix that I got emotional when I was invited to this, because I was invited as an equal and an intellectual, not just a person with a disability. And I did kind of notice the move where you guys dropped the letters after your name, which, I appreciate, but you didn't have to do. But you bring up a good word, responsive design. Maybe that's the word that replaces ethical or universal. It's responsive design. How are we responding to the community at large, as each community might be defined differently on what they need to provide?
As someone that works on museum programming and tries to be inclusive, I find that a program is most inclusive if it is designed for a diverse audience, because it encompasses everybody, as opposed to having to do changes to our neurotypical individuals where we feel we have to have other things in consideration. It became so clear when we were designing a tour for low vision or non-sighted visitors and wanted to include works of art that could be touched. And a curatorial team had given us some that could be, and the staff was working on them and having such a great time, and wanted to know why the tour was only going to be offered for people with low vision or no sight. So I find if you turn it inside out, that it all comes together, and it's equal for everybody.
And this my kind of question stroke comment follows from very well actually from what Linda said, and I was thinking about the first question: what does ethical design mean to you? And I was going, oh, what does it mean? And then what if a neurodivergent individual is the model museum visitor? And I think, to me, ethical design is rooted in social justice. Right, and that's the core of it. And if we make, if our neurodivergent individuals are the model museum visitors, then we are more open to different behaviors, people who don't adhere to the rules, people who act a bit weird and differently to what your security person who is going to go, oh, can I help you? You know? And but also that opens doors to these gangs of teenagers who have never been in an art gallery. And because the art gallery is not for them. In Cork City, the Crawford Art Gallery, which is now closed for renovation, is a space that we both absolutely love. I know a lot of teenage kids who would never dream of walking through the doors because it's not for them, especially if they're poor, if they're not well spoken. But that experience can be transformative. So to me, it's opening to people not just who are neurodiverse, but who are poor, who don't have access to art, who don't have access to the culture that we as affluent professionals and our kids as the kids of affluent professionals, whether they're neurodivergent or not, have. So it irons out a lot of these inequalities, and I think that can only be a good thing.
I wasn't going to say anything, but that last comment made me feel compelled to. So I'm Jennifer. I used to work here and across the street, and I'm the director of a small art museum. I shouldn't immunize it. It's one of the largest collections of any community college in the country, and it's in Bridgeport, Connecticut at CT State Housatonic. And we do exactly what the last person just said. Community colleges in Connecticut are open to all. We have many students who are neurodivergent, ages 16 to 80, and our art is everywhere. It's on every wall of every office space, academic space, hallway, and the vision is that art should be for everyone. So our students may not know it, but they're entering a gallery every day on their way to class, on their way to the cafeteria, dropping their kid off at the child studies or the child daycare on campus, or benefiting from the food pantry. So I just say that there are models out there in community college museums, as was mentioned, our partner at Gateway, our sister at Gateway. We're here and we want to partner, and we are grateful to be part of this, so thank you.
I love the idea of the art going to where the people are rather than the people having to go to where the art is.
Hi, this is more maybe of a comment to get you all thinking and going on it. Design aesthetics, or ethics. I've been having a problem as an artist with PTSD and autism. I have 2 kids on the spectrum. The idea of what autism is by other people, I think, determines the experience for us. And it's there's a lot of misconceptions. Ethically, I find it problematic that everywhere I go, there's like autism signs on the library, as if it's support. But when I speak up about actually this thing that's going on here is really, really difficult for my family. And it's easier for me to speak up for my kids because especially my younger son, it's more obvious with stimming or something like that. So people might be more understanding. And if they can't tell, it's harder to be understood. And if it's disruptive, it's no longer inclusive. So I do feel like that these become buzzwords, and ethically it's upsetting to me where it makes a place look better to say inclusivity, accessibility. I'm actually getting really almost tired of the words at the school. And then when my son has trouble because the environment isn't suitable in a lot of ways, or there's small changes that need to be made, it isn't supported. So it looks good on the newsletter. And then when it's disruptive or it would require change, it doesn't actually happen. Or if it doesn't appear as if the human has this need. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it totally makes sense. And I'm only going to put one foot on the soapbox right now, so I'll save you guys a huge lecture. But there is I used to live in the US. I was born and raised here, and I know that there's a huge funding stream that goes to these large organizations that take the funding and they get into the community somehow. I call that trickle-down disability advocacy. And it does not work, you're right. It's just you have an Autism Speaks or puzzle piece or whatever on the door, and you think you're going into a friendly space, and you're really just going into an organization that accepted some funding to do a couple of things like change the color of the south wall. Right. And so I totally understand where you're coming from. And I think that's exactly what we're talking about here and what we're trying to change, and why having people with disabilities at those levels of making those decisions is important, so that we can have a broader understanding of autism is a spectrum. And no, there's always gonna be that like 5% on each end that we're just not gonna be able to reach, that might still need that extra help, or might need to go, gee, you know, I really need a quiet space to run to and I can't find it. And I get that. But as we keep broadening the discussion, it takes redefining that autism is not this person screaming in the corner lacking empathy that wants everybody to leave the building. Not for everybody, right? We need to be able to have this conversation. So I totally hear you on that. And I've actually pushed so hard against Autism Speaks. I got cut off from they won't respond to my emails anymore. I'm not the favorite person there. I can give you a list of all the buildings I'm no longer allowed in. Because I spoke up, so I understand this problem, and I hope that this conversation is what's going to start changing that.
So to your point, Stuart and I were just in Dublin at the Autism Europe Congress, which was a really special occasion, and it may have been that I was in the minority there. I don't know how many thousands of people were there, but it was packed with self-advocates, which was quite extraordinary, and they were enormously articulate about what are priorities for them. And Stuart presented some work that he's let me sort of look over his shoulder on, looking at how the domains of interest in terms of moving communities forward towards these words, inclusion or accommodation, whatever we want to say, don't necessarily align with first-person reports by autistics in terms of what they want. And so design guidelines and, you know, reported ask is not necessarily converging yet. And so hopefully, Stuart, we're going to write this up as a paper, right? We're going to like put it out there for more people to see, but at least as evidence that we're recognizing that we're not operationalizing this very well, even if intent is good. And while we were there, there was an effort to recognize Dublin has done an extraordinary amount of work to become autism friendly, but we're acknowledging that even though they've got this beautiful 48-page report about what to do, they were having trouble translating it from paper into action. And were convening roundtables with us while we were there about how to make that happen. So it is a universal struggle that deserves all of us figuring out how to work together to do better.
Yeah, I see that. I want to like acknowledge that. I think this work takes so much time, and it takes a lot of effort. And I think part of the like ethics is, how do we continue to prioritize this work, have the conversations, bring the, you know, with the right people. And I don't know, like I run into this all the time, like time frame of like a semester, or the time frame of how long you have a budget for a corporate initiative. And these are not excuses. These are just like, this is what people are running into all of the time. And so I don't know, I was thinking about museums too, and I was like Linda's been here for a really long time. And I think part of that is why it's been so successful, is because you need somebody you need people who can steward these initiatives for a long period of time to make these like giant changes. And so like, I'm really appreciative of everyone in this room who's like giving days to think about it and talk about it and continue to think about like how we can kind of spread the work and move it forward, because it's not, you can't just put up a sign. You can't just change the color of a wall. And even, you know, redesigning a space or a playground, you need to think about how are people interacting in that space, and how are you enabling those kinds of interactions.
Hi, my name is Charlotte. Thank you so much for all of the sessions today, and this one is discussion in particular. I think one of the things that's come up just now is that, you know, as much as design matters, it's also the people who are facilitating that design who make a huge difference, and what a responsibility we have to make sure that the people who work and volunteer in these spaces are properly trained and repeatedly trained and included throughout that, so that when someone comes in, if someone, you know, if that isn't the right space for a particular person, you know, the people around are able to respond appropriately and supportively. And I think that element is just so essential. And I think as a space, as a museum centers neurodivergent individuals more, you're going to hopefully, you will ultimately start to include more of those folks on staff as well. And so then that leads to a cultural shift that's necessary in the way that you are hiring, in the way that you are training people, in the way that you are, you know, creating that environment, that work environment as well. And so I think it's so essential and so important. I just, you know, thank you for that conversation.
Hi, this question is for actually the entire panel. So what I'm experiencing from my perspective is that whenever I hear the term neurodivergent, somebody somewhere always associates it with autism and sometimes use it as a euphemism for autism. And I think there are a lot of people in our world that are not seeing how this is a broader concept and just really looking at it as these are people whose brains work differently and allow them to experience the world from a different perspective. So how do we get that message out? Because when I hear it, I'm a little afraid to go and say, tap their shoulder. I'm like, well, actually, the definition is. So I wanted your thoughts.
For me, and part of this comes from my work in a hospital. I'm part of a lot of groups that are trying to have systems change around how we care for this population. And what I have tried to sort of reiterate is it may not be about a label, but it may be about a feeling or a behavior that someone has, and trying to emphasize that these might be things that would support people who have anxiety or people who have sensory vulnerabilities, and focus it more on the target of somebody's need rather than on a label. I don't know that, I don't mean it as a workaround, but I think when you do it that way, it opens it up to be, oh, well, you know what, that would actually help me. I mean, I am not on the spectrum, but I'm finding it really uncomfortable to have these lights shining in my eyes. And, you know, so it would support me if somebody said, you know, would you like me to dim the lights, right? And I mean, that may be something people automatically think about, at least in the hospital, putting lights on dimmers for kids who can't tolerate. So it's more of and you know, what you're looking to get out of these supports rather than exactly a defined population, if that's fair.
I don't have a good answer.
So I remember the dialogue starting because I was diagnosed when Asperger's was still in the diagnostic criteria. And so then we got rid of Asperger's and we started to put it under the umbrella. I think everybody kind of knows the basic history of that. And then it was, I'm not autistic, I'm a person with autism. And I was like, we spend so much time trying to decide which word didn't offend us that we lost the opportunity to educate them about what we need. Right. So I actually try not to worry too much about the vocabulary. And if you want a call to action, like right now, how do you change this in society? Get involved in your local school boards. Your teachers are completely overwhelmed and they have no time to even help neurotypical kids learn, much less kids with disabilities. And that is a ground up opportunity to educate the next generation on learning to be accepting of disability, to understanding how this vocabulary works, what's important and how to change the world as they go into it. They're the ones with all the energy. So let's feed them.
We have time for one final question.
Ooh,
I know, pressure's on.
Just a couple of reflections on where we are. I think one of the things you've talked about self-advocacy and the extraordinary power of that. One of the things that we need to keep in mind today, there's no alternative anymore to self-advocacy. That is the only way people move forward. There's nobody left to take care of business. So that self-advocacy is really going to be important. And just a thought on one of the realities about this culture. We have focused on independence as the central concern of this extraordinary society. But I think part of what we have to get to is a return to an understanding of interdependence as a reality and an opportunity today as we talk about who's responsible. This department bears all the responsibility. This group bears all the responsibility. I think we are seeing the end game of how far independence can take us. And that interdependence is something that comes from indigenous cultures all over the world. And I think we have something to learn there. And it's a wonderful opportunity to be energized by the sense of we are all in it together and owe something to one another.
I love the tension inherent in that comment, right? Self-advocacy and interdependence at the same time. And yes.
I want to thank our panelists, and if you would join me in thanking our panelists. And thank you all for your wonderful questions and engagements this afternoon. And with that, I'll turn, yeah, thank you. Sorry.
Thank you. All right, everybody, I get the fun job of, this is the hard and the easy part. I'm feeling all sorts of feelings now, so hopefully I won't just collapse into a puddle of liquid. But hard to add to what has already been a robust and wide-ranging set of discussions on a topic that is by its nature professionally interdisciplinary and personally affecting to so many. Hard to give due gratitude to those who contributed to those discussions, and hard to say goodbye. Easy, however, to have the last word. There will be no Q&A after this, my friends. So if you have something to say to me, you can meet me in the parking lot. I want to begin by extending on behalf of the entire YCBA our sincere gratitude to our program participants and session panelists and interlocutors from Yale and further afield. In order of appearance, and please hold your applause to the end, Jessica Sack, Jennifer Coet, Kimada Legendre, Rebecca McGinnis, James McPartland, Sean Alquist, Valerie Fletcher, Elihu Rubin, Megan Cernich, Laura Nadine, Sarah Rottenberg, and Aaron Friedlander. Special thanks is owed especially to Stuart Nielsen for providing his prodigious insights and the thought-provoking aesthetic touchstone for our discussions. To the organizers of the symposium in research, Christina Ferrando, I actually just put your first names here, Claire, Jen, thank you all for your tireless effort. Christina, this was truly an intellectual and organizational marathon, which you won, trust me. Let's also thank my colleagues in education, always, for supporting our access programs and this symposium. And of course, my mentor and friend and the mastermind behind this great gathering, Linda Friedlander. Where are you? Okay, and now for some remarks, which hopefully aren't too long-winded and probably will just be preaching to the choir. As a lapsed Catholic and the son of a man who was once a priest, I can't help but feel I approach these situations as though I have to deliver a homily. A homily for those non-Catholics is like a sermon, a commentary on the scripture. My first thought was to deliver a fire and brimstone diatribe condemning the meritocracy and the cult of individualism that holds hostage this ship of fools we call America. But then I thought to myself, Matt, these people are tired. They're digesting a full day's worth of very thoughtful discussions. The last thing they need is to hear your half-baked political philosophy. Also, you're still at work, so you should probably just play it cool. One regret that I'll probably have to live with the rest of my life is that I never got to hear, sorry, I promised myself I wouldn't cry, but my father's homilies. He was a priest and then he got married and moved to the sticks and became a toy maker long before I was born. But I was thinking about his decision to turn his back on a social station that guaranteed him security and deference from others in his culture, and his insistence on being self-employed and self-sufficient as possible. It's a story of self-determination. And our friend Jenny Coet reminds us it's self-determination is a great good that we all strive to achieve and should strive to provide to others. It's a good unto itself, not measurable by financial success or self-esteem. I'm sorry, social esteem, not self-esteem. Self-esteem is good. Self-determination can end in heartbreak, in fact, but without it, life is desaturated and imposition a series of events that happen to us and not through us. Moving on from that self-indulgent story about my father, which was by proxy a story about me, it's nice to tell and hear stories about people, biographies, autobiographies, memoirs, etc. We love to hear about the making of a mind. How did someone become the person they are? How did a person achieve greatness, notoriety, self-actualization? That's actually not the most interesting thing to me in my line of work as a museum educator. I care very much about individual people, but as an educator, I'm dedicated to the collective mind, whether that is the collective mind of a mentor and a mentee, or the collective mind of a class, or of a group of students interacting with others in their community. In cognitive science, distributed cognition refers to the ways in which thought processes, memory storage and retrieval, and other tasks of the mind are not performed in the brain of any one individual, but are coordinated across people, tools and instruments, and environmental contexts. This idea was first given depth by anthropologist Edwin Hutchins, who studied how the crew and instruments of a naval research vessel acted together to perform complex cognitive tasks that no one person could perform on their own. And I'm actually reminded of some discussions we had earlier about museums and how many roles are required to get anything done and how long it takes. So that's a rather extreme example, but it offers us a roadmap for understanding examples of how cognition is distributed in our daily lives and in educational settings. The human brain is a unit in a distributed field, and once we open our eyes, our nostrils, ears, and mouth, and extend our fingers and toes, that brain is swimming in a sea of signals and giving off signals of its own. Just as people, things, and environments can enable some people to participate in cognitive networks, they can also disable people from functioning in those networks. Intellectual traditions and economic systems direct us to pay attention to and evaluate the development of each individual and to allocate resources to increase the chances of success for the most promising students. Built environments are designed for directing typical brains and bodies through a place. Stuart Nielsen's work makes cognitive networks visible. It gives linear structure to constellations of points moving in space. It also reveals the potentially disabling effects of networks that exclude some brains and some bodies. Stewart is a truth teller. Likewise, Hugh Locke, whose work is on view in the entrance court and the second floor of this museum, is a truth teller of a different sort, revealing a macabre and subterranean inversion of the austere, stone-faced textbook narratives of history. Acts of exclusion and exploitation reemerge as ghosts from the past inhabiting the decay of empire. The truth is, systems fail people, but people can also build systems that better serve everyone. Neurodiverse people can build systems that integrate neurodivergence. Here in the museum, we try to create many points of engagement for many different people, not just for their own sake, but to generate connectivity among people and across people and things in our building, to put them in conversation with each other, to make things happen through people and not to people. And as Jessica, Jenny, and Rebecca mentioned earlier, museum education is co-creative, and educators are co-creators with visitors. How much time do I have? Okay. Recently, I was watching one of my favorite YouTube channels, and I don't know how you feel about it, but it's Special Books by Special Kids with Chris Ulmer. He's the interviewer, and it's an unexpected title for what is actually a series of interviews performed by a 30-something-year-old man, interviewing people with a full spectrum of physical, social, and cognitive disabilities. What I like about his interviews is that he intends for his audience, disabled and non-disabled people alike, to learn from, not just learn about, the people he interviews. He simply asks us to accept the full range of human experience and to understand each other. He recently posted a rare video that was not an interview, but an explanation of why he wears the same light blue sweater in many of his interviews. He has multiples of the same sweater. One reason he gave was that he doesn't want to become the focus of attention. He doesn't want to give his audience any reason to notice him or think about him. It struck me that Chris had thought about his role in a distributed cognitive enterprise, the goal of which is to bring the messages and voices of his interviewees to the world. Earlier today, Sean Alquist's explanation of his role as a non-designing designer of informed approaches to design, not his exact words, and the conversation around creating inclusive design reminded me of this self-awareness that I saw in Chris Ulmer. We can look to people like Chris and Sean and our other panelists as examples of how we can generate collective creative learning by putting ourselves in the service of a larger cognitive project that involves neurodiverse people. So it's okay to put on that familiar light blue sweater and sit around the periphery and be a part of that distributed mind. I'm heartened that so many of you have joined us here for this symposium to continue that effort. Thank you.